She lay on the cold tiles like a wilted flower plucked from life a moment before it bloomed. An overturned wineglass lay nearby, the last witness to her poisonous farewell. There was something strange about this death, too familiar, almost repetitive. Nothing around gave any signs of drama, but there was a sense of unspokenness in the air. If someone were watching, they could tell she had been dying before. Meanwhile, in the depths of limbo, where time stood still and guilt weighed heavily, another trial was underway. The king of the underworld carried out his affairs, strictly, mercilessly, like the law itself. His face remained calm, but behind it lay the knowledge of pain and betrayal. Today's sentence rang especially loud: 20,000 years in boiling cauldrons, punishment for cruelty to the common people. But the usual course of events was disrupted by an unexpected guest. The girl appeared in the hall confidently, as if the hostess had returned home. Blonde hair, a familiar fire in her eyes, an indignation that had long been boiling inside her. This soul had come here before. Its life had been cut short every time in the same place. At 25, again. She remembered everything: the machine that had stopped her heart, the sudden attack, the betrayal, and now the poison. Too many deaths, too few explanations. Her indignation was louder than the groans of sinners, and her demands were precise and unappealing. While the servants silently hid their eyes, the king considered his next move. He couldn't just brush her off. She wasn't the kind of person who could be silenced. He had to offer her reincarnation, but not ordinary, into the body of a girl who was once wealthy, beautiful, the only daughter in her family. There was still room in her destiny for another's soul. The new prospect intrigued Ariana. Everything seemed too good: youth, wealth, a comfortable body for a new start. But even she felt there was a catch. Such deals don't happen for nothing. And although the king promised to keep her alive at least until the new 25th anniversary, a question remained in the air that no one was in a hurry to answer. What would be the price of this new chance? The king of the underworld turned away defiantly. Too many conditions, too many words. His patience had limits, and it was close to the limit. But when she suddenly agreed, albeit with a hint of doubt, he threw her a gold medallion. It flashed in the air, shimmering with colorful stones, and fell softly into her palm. Inside were 3 precious stones, each with its own power. The red one had the power to heal, capable of bringing life back, even from the brink of death. Blue allowed you to see the world through someone else's eyes, an illusion of control that does not tolerate abuse. And green opened up new abilities, awakening the incredible, but unpredictable, in the body. All these pores required caution. But as soon as the girl saw another stone, a small round one that resembled a caramel, she threw it into her mouth without thinking. The taste was so-so, even disappointing. The king, who had already begun to read about the properties of the golden pearl, froze. An aura of blue light instantly enveloped the girl. Her hand began to disappear before his eyes. He was shocked, but it was too late. She was gone. In the throne room, only a slight flicker in the air remained, and he was left with a headache and the question, what to do with this now? Ariana didn't hear what the pearl was for, but she decided, since she was already moving into the body of a 20-year-old girl, she would get another 5 years. This time, without mistakes, without disasters. She sincerely intended to live happily ever after, forward into a new life. Her new awakening began in silence. A spacious bed, expensive fabrics, dimmed lights. She slowly opened her eyes, allowing her emerald gaze to take in the space around her for the first time. The estate looked luxurious. I wasn't lying, damn it. Everything was up to par. 2 maids stood nearby. They were talking quietly, anxious, agitated. Suddenly, something rustled in the room, and when the girls turned their heads, they saw the body they had just thought was dead stand up and look at them. They screamed. They ran away in panic, leaving behind silence and a frightened air. Ariana smiled wryly. What's more, they thought there was a corpse lying there, but instead, a surprise. With difficulty, she got out of bed. Step by step, she approached the mirror. Her silver hair fell to her shoulders, framing a new, striking face. Her eyes sparkled with a deep green, but as soon as she glanced down, she froze. The reflection was too generous, She could barely fit in the mirror. The figure was magnificent, full of shapes and lines she hadn't expected. Her face was drawn in surprise. This was definitely a bonus without warning. Life was just beginning, but it seemed to have decided to start with humor. The residence of Duke Rodolina was enveloped in morning calm. However, in one of her rooms, a soul had just awakened, for whom fate had prepared a much more turbulent day than a simple recovery. Ariana, who had just moved into the body of the Duke's only daughter, she stood by the window, wrapped in a light peignoir, and silently looked out at the gardens that stretched to the horizon. As if nothing had happened, she gently touched the glass windows. But her thoughts were far from calm. The words of the ruler of the underground kingdom still sounded in her memory, promising wealth, title, youth, the body of a noble girl. In words, everything seemed perfect, but now that she saw herself in the glass, indignation rose from the depths of her new self. She tousled her silver hair angrily, as if trying to regain some control. Her body felt foreign and heavy. It didn't obey her as she was used to. Every movement was labored. She dreamed of a long life, free from disease, with love, not a trap. But now she had to act differently, investigate who she was, where she was, and what resources she possessed. One thing was clear: she wasn't going to die just like that again. If life gave her another chance, she would take everything from him. There was a knock on the door. A young maid entered with a breakfast tray. There was relief in her voice. Seeing the lady at the open window, the girl hurried to close it and helped the Duchess sit down. Her concern was sincere, almost maternal. She called the hostess a dandelion, fragile, vulnerable. But in the new Rukina, these words only evoked internal sarcasm. No typhoon would move this body from its place. What kind of fragility are we talking about? Recovering from her shock, Ariana finally asked who this girl was. She introduced herself as Sherry Miura, Mrs. Rukina's servant, and agreed to tell her everything she knew about her mistress. The new name was telling: Rukina Yvette Rodelin, daughter of Duke Edmund Matthew Rodelin, sole heiress. In a past life, Ariana had heard something about this man, an aristocrat who cared for orphans. His figure had an aura of nobility, but it remained somewhere far away, in theory. Now she had to see this man up close and understand who he really was. Sherry added that the lady grew up in love, care, and was adored by her father, but the last month of her life turned into a struggle with death. No one knew the exact cause, but poisoning was suspected. Yesterday, the doctor almost gave up, admitting that there was no chance. The words about poison made the girl rub her forehead again. It was happening again. She thought the aristocracy was immune to this, but it seemed that even in the most elegant estates, poisoned glasses found their purpose. As she was pondering this, the door suddenly flew open. Her father burst into the room. Duke Rodelin, known as the Ice Duke, was not holding back his emotions. He held his daughter in his arms, as if he were afraid she would disappear again. There was real pain in his voice, and that surprised Ariana more than anything else. Behind him, she saw no icy mask, only a man who had lost and found the most precious thing. The emotional reunion was interrupted by an assistant who reminded her of an invitation to a dinner party at the Marquis Talon's. The Duke, without even hesitating, refused. There was a categoricalness in his words. His daughter was more important than any marquis. But the new Rukin had other plans. She politely but persistently asked permission to join the dinner. Such an event could give her answers. There might be those present who had a motive. She had to see these faces, assess their reactions, catch the nuances. Now it was not just a desire, but a necessity. The evening promised to be decisive. And somewhere deep in Rukina's new soul, a plan was already maturing. The Marquise Talon's ball room sparkled with the gold of the chandeliers and the rustle of silk skirts. Everything around radiated a sophisticated worldliness, the kind that smelled of perfume, wine, and hidden intentions. However, when the daughter of Duke Rodolina entered the hall, the air seemed to thicken. Rukina walked slowly through the crowd. Her dress, exquisitely trimmed with lace, caught the light with every stitch of embroidery. The outfit was luxurious, as befits a daughter of her kind, but every movement was difficult. The body she had become accustomed to until now did not want to obey. The feeling of heaviness and uncharacteristic bulkiness was annoying, but she held her head high. The guests froze. Some turned around, some stopped talking, and some even began to whisper. Their reaction was mixed: curiosity, contempt, surprise. Rukina felt these looks almost physically, and she understood. Her new body did not arouse admiration. It seems that even before the tragedy, this girl was already more of a burden to the social circle than a decoration of the evenings. She sat down on the nearby sofa with such effort that her dress stretched at the seams. Her gaze swept across the hall, not stopping anyone. Everything was clear in her mind. I was the daughter of a duke, and they had forgotten how to greet those older in rank? Sherry stood nearby, silent and wary. Evie turned her head to her and asked in a whisper if she was an exile. The servant's silence was deeper than any answer. However, in the end, Sherry confessed that there was one person who was sincere about her: Ellis Millick, the daughter of the Marquise, and a childhood friend. Sherry's words had barely settled in her memory when a familiar voice sounded nearby. A pale, graceful girl with dark, shiny hair seemed to have emerged from a fairy tale. Her face was alight with anxiety and joy at the same time, and there were tears in her eyes. She looked like Snow White, who had decided to step off the page of a fairy tale for a moment. Just as fragile, but confident, she approached Rukina with tenderness and sincerity. Her feelings seemed genuine. Ariana, now Rukina, felt that someone from the past was really standing before her. But there was another detail behind this moment. Sherry didn't even look up at Ellis. Her silence was tense. Meanwhile, Ellis was touching Rukina's face with excitement, saying that it seemed to have shrunk. There was concern mixed with undisguised surprise in her words. Rukina, although confused, thanked him, trying not to show her inner surprise. Soon a servant approached them, carrying a tray of small pastries, cakes, and sweet rolls. It turned out that Ellis had prepared all of this for her friend. In advance, she was glad that Ivy had come and wanted to comfort her with familiar tastes. But Rukina only glanced at the dishes and shuddered inwardly. Just looking at them brought on a feeling of guilt. This is exactly the daily dose of calories. If she takes a bite, she will stretch 2 more sizes. But Ellis did not give up. She joyfully held out the cream bun, as if it were a gift. Rukina politely refused, but the tray was already in front of her. The girl took one, not so much out of desire as out of politeness, and was ready to take a tiny bite. But Ellis said something that almost made her swallow the treat. She remembered how Rukina had once eaten 8 plates and talked about her figure with such ease, as if it were an innocent trifle. Then she added that even half a bun was too much for her, but not for her friend. There was no malice in her voice, only something like indulgent sincerity. Rukina froze, holding the bun in her suddenly heavy fingers. Her eyes slowly lifted to Ellis. A short but meaningful phrase flashed through her mind. What had she just said? There was more to this conversation than just food or friendship. There were echoes of the attitude that had haunted Rukina even before her death. And it was clear that the body's past was not about to let go. Ellis sighed and pretended to be open about how jealous she was of Yvette. She said she ate whatever she wanted and was still as cute as ever. She had to restrict herself every day. The words were movingly delivered, but Yvette felt something inside her twist. She responded politely, calling Ellis beautiful, but even her voice was tired. This game was starting to get annoying. Ellis smiled in response, sighing in mock embarrassment. She said Yvette was always too modest. At that very moment, their husband, Viscount Barclay, joined them. He immediately intervened in the conversation, showering Ellis with epithets and kissing her hand with feigned sincerity. It all looked like a performance for the audience, where the roles had long been written out. Ellis, without wasting any time, continued. Once she was, they say, a role model, but now she was just a wildflower on a mountainside. And of course, she added the phrase about extra pounds, nodding towards Yvette with the same playful smile. Barclay laughed, picking up on the game, but Yvette couldn't smile anymore. Something clicked inside her. Her face changed. The smile disappeared. Her eyes darkened. Her fingers convulsively gripped the plate, which could not withstand the strain, and cracked in her hand. Ellis's words were like a tinkling mirror, shiny on the outside, but sharp and cold on the inside. The one everyone thought was cute had had enough. A clear phrase cut through my thoughts. This fool is only pretending to be a friend. Friends forever? No way. And then Ellis said the name. Lex Orabioni, the prince, and added with feigned surprise that it was his heart that belonged to Yvette. Yvette herself shuddered. She didn't remember any Lex, especially since he had chosen her. Her thoughts stopped. Had she gotten herself into a complicated tangle of other people's relationships again? And then something else happened. The crown princes entered the hall. Suddenly, everyone turned. Their gazes, as if on a team, shifted to the youngest of them, the second crown prince. His eyes fell on Yvette, and without a second's hesitation, he walked over and hugged her with such warmth that left no doubt. Lex's voice sounded confident, as if it were a long-awaited meeting. He called her his bride. He bent down on one knee, kissed her hand. The entire hall froze. The gazes shifted from Ellis to Yvette. Now they had something new in them. Surprise, disbelief, envy. Yvette was embarrassed. She felt herself blushing, and unable to contain her excitement, she went out onto the balcony. She needed air. Just air. Sherry, silent and devoted as ever, followed her. There, on the porch, Yvette took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She turned to Sherry with a question. Why didn't she tell her that she had a fiancé? The maid was embarrassed. She thought it had already been mentioned, among the many things they had discussed. She just hadn't had time to emphasize it. Yvette shook her head. The situation was gaining momentum. Not long ago, she had simply wanted to know who she was. Now, everything was taking on a political tone. Being engaged to a prince is not a personal matter. It is a tool. She felt that her life was not just new, but also incredibly complicated. But she already knew one thing for sure. You could trust only a few people here, and Ellis was not one of them. Yvette, still a little embarrassed after the unexpected scene with the prince, automatically slapped herself on the cheek, as if to check if she was still really here. Even the groom, and he turned out to be a complex part of this new puzzle into which fate had thrown her. Cherie, all delighted, did not stop. With her arms pressed to her chest and eyes shining like a child's, she enthusiastically recounted the story of Yvette and Prince Lexian's acquaintance. He said that 5 years ago he fell in love at first sight. He proposed that same day, and since then he hasn't stopped sending letters, gifts, and flowers. She spoke with such sincerity that it seemed that it was not her mistress's love story, but the maid's own personal tale. Yvette listened, staring into space. What she heard sounded unreal. Lexian was not just a prince, he was an ideal. Handsome, noble, unattainable. The one who could choose any woman in the empire. Why Rukina? What made him become attached to her, even back then, 5 years ago? Maybe it's just a convenient alliance. A ducal daughter is a good political move. Maybe she's just another pawn on the grand chessboard of imperial marriages. But Sherry denied it, even in her mind. She confidently insisted, "It's not about status. Lexian's love is real. He didn't hide his feelings and was always sincere." Yvette nodded, although her doubts remained, especially after she noticed how attentively the prince spoke to Ellis in the hall, smiling at her as if the two of them had their own story, invisible to others. This made my heart clench. A strange excitement, a cold lump in my chest. Whether it was jealousy or the fear of being deceived again, she didn't have time to comprehend these emotions when another guest appeared from behind the column on the balcony. The third hereditary prince of the empire. Prince Hiron, Lexian's younger brother, had a different aura. There was no competition in his gaze, and his movements conveyed a calm confidence. His presence did not shout, but enveloped. He turned to Yvette, with a warm smile, asking if she remembered him, as if with hope. She bowed and carefully said his name, Hiron Orabioni. While Yvette was trying to figure out if she had ever known him, he had already come closer, as if blurring the boundaries of personal space. There was tenderness in his eyes. Sherry silently took a step aside. Her gaze softened. It seemed that of all the nobles, this was the man she trusted. Hay carefully took off his cloak and threw it over Yvette's shoulders. His concern needed no words. There was no drama in it, just genuine attention. His touch sent a warm wave through the girl's body. After a brief conversation, he leaned over, gently took her hand, and kissed it, like a knight, with honor and respect. Then he disappeared into the twilight of the hall, leaving behind a strange sense of security. Eve was left alone, standing on the balcony, clutching her cloak to herself. Only 3 days had passed since she opened her eyes in a new body, and life was already beginning to spin her in a whirlpool of intrigue, feelings, and secrets. It wasn't yet clear who was sincere and who was wearing a mask. But she knew one thing for sure. It was time to play her role, carefully, judiciously, and to the end. After the event, the company gathered in the garden for tea. The silence of the evening barely touched the rose leaves, and the soft light of the lanterns gave the meeting coziness and warmth. Ellis, in her usual playfulness, blossomed with a new idea. She wanted to be a bridesmaid at Eve and Lexian's upcoming wedding. She enthusiastically talked about how romantic it was to hold the bouquet and be there for her at such a moment. Lexian supported her opinion with the same ease with which he courted everyone around him. He emphasized that Ellis was the most beautiful of all, and would undoubtedly be the decoration of the wedding ceremony. Ellis laughed, blushing slightly, but not from modesty, but from the pleasure of feeling like the center of attention. Yvette was silent. She sat with a cup in her hands, but the tea had long since cooled, and her fingers remained motionless. Her thoughts were confused. She had seen too much that evening. Everything became clearer. How Rukina was pushed to vulnerability, how they were hiding behind friendship to oppress, humiliate, and overshadow her presence. Eve no longer doubted. Rukina's world was surrounded by fake smiles. Ellis leaned closer, insisting, "She's the only friend. Doesn't Eves want to see her by his side on their wedding day?" But Yvette didn't answer. She just looked at the girl, silently, indifferently. There was neither indignation nor agreement in that look, only a shadow of pity, not for Ellis, but for that naive soul that Rukina had once been. Lexian, meanwhile, remembered the rosary of the Marquis of Delta, who had been boasting about his garden during dinner. He suggested that they go and see the roses. Ellis, of course, was the first to respond. The man glanced briefly at Yvette, as if expecting permission or consent, but the girl calmly replied that she didn't want to. She was tired, and if they wanted to, let them go together. Lexian didn't object. He just nodded to Hay to stay with Yvette. He and Ellis disappeared into the twilight of the garden, engrossed in a conversation that sounded like a continuation of a play. Hay, smiling, waved at them, but Yvette didn't react. Her face remained stony. The thought pulsed in her head. This is not love, not friendship. What she saw was just a theater, where Rukina was a convenient backdrop for other people's whims. The prince, who is supposedly in love, pays attention to another. Supposedly in, a friend who swears loyalty enjoys the role of the only close person as long as it is beneficial. Rukina's life was sad. But Yvette will not allow this story to be repeated. She will no longer be anyone's background. Hay approached Yvette, his gaze studying her face. His presence, soft and warm, made the girl's heart beat faster. She looked away in embarrassment and took a step back, not because she was afraid, but because the sudden closeness of this man created an unsettling tension. He looked too calm, too friendly, as if he were genuinely interested in her thoughts. It was disconcerting. He smiled, and she, unable to bear that look, forced herself to ask herself the most painful thing: the engagement. How did it happen that she, Yvette, became the bride of the second prince? Hay shrugged. It seemed that he himself did not fully understand how it all began. Night fell on the estate. The room was quiet, but Yvette's soul could not find peace. The girl turned from side to side until she finally got out of bed and walked out into the hallway, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. For the past day, she had been thinking about the same thing. Prince Lexian, his strange friendliness towards Ellis, his constant glances that bordered on tenderness. This couldn't be a coincidence. Next to them is the silent Hay. He remained a mystery. Outwardly, he was calm, even caring. But what was hidden behind this mask? However, it was Lexian who worried the most. If he was only interested in power, if he only sought support for the ducal house in Rukin, then it is possible that he could resort to the worst. She knew the poisoning was no accident. But who was behind it? And is there a chance to find out the truth, without putting her life in danger again? Her thoughts were interrupted for a moment. Shadows appeared ahead. Yvette stopped, and holding a lantern in her hands, hid behind a column. Voices came from around the corner. She recognized them immediately, Ellis and Lexian. The girl held her breath. Ellis's tone changed from gentle to nervous. Her words were filled with indignation, her voice with anger. She reproached the prince for having to pretend that being near Yvette was an honor. Her words sounded rude, contemptuous. Lex asked to calm down, as if trying to keep the situation under control. Everything inside Yvette went cold. Her suspicions were coming true. It wasn't delusion. It wasn't jealousy. It was the truth. Ugly, vile, and painful. Her heart clenched painfully. Bitterness welled up in her chest. She froze for a moment, clutching at her own clothes to keep from falling. But suddenly, in the silence, a lantern fell. A dull sound instantly cut through the air. Lexion became alert. His voice became sharper. He ordered anyone who dared to eavesdrop on the prince's conversation to leave. Yvette wanted to run away, but her feet seemed to be glued to the floor. Her body wouldn't obey. A feeling of powerlessness washed over her. Her eyes were clouded with tears. She could neither speak nor move. All of Rukina's emotions burst forth in her with raw pain. And at that very moment, when all seemed lost, Hay appeared from the darkness. His figure emerged silently, confidently. And without blinking an eye, he took the blame. He said he was the one who accidentally overheard the conversation. Yvette froze. Her lips barely moved. She didn't have time to say anything. She just looked at the prince, who again, unexpectedly for her, became a protector. After Hay's intervention, the tension in the air eased a bit, but the unease remained. He apologized for interrupting, but stressed the importance of caution in the castle, a place where any carelessness could cost your life. Lexian cast a careful glance at Ellis, as if confirming that Hay's words carried weight. Prince Hay gestured for Yvette to hide behind the wall so she wouldn't be noticed, but the question lingered in her mind. How much had he heard? Did he know everything? Anxiety was penetrating deep into her consciousness. Lexian tried to calm Ellis down, assuring her that everything would be okay, but she was determined. She didn't want to see him again. He hurried after her, trying to keep her from making any rash decisions. Hay, feeling that the danger had passed, allowed Yvette to come out of hiding. He admitted that he knew about Lexion and Ellis's complicated relationship, but because of his status, he could not reveal the truth earlier. Eve could not hold back tears as she spoke about the attempted poisoning, and reminded her that she shouldn't pretend everything was fine. Hay tried to calm her down by touching her cheek, but the girl pushed his hand away with obvious anger. She sharply declared that there had never been true love between her and Lexion. Hay was surprised and asked why she was saying that. Yvette replied that she was not crying because of the betrayal, but was asking to be left alone. Hay was upset. He didn't know Yvette like that. She dropped his hand, thanked him for his help, and warned him that she didn't want him to pretend to be her friend anymore. Deep down, Hay was hurt, but he immediately burst out laughing, which surprised Yvette. She thought he was crazy, but he explained that at first, he thought she would cry for months. But instead, Eve changed. The girl set her a condition. If he wants her to continue to remain close to him, he must answer one question. Hay agreed. One thing bothered her. Why had Lexian really become engaged to her? Or was it just because of Duke Rodellin's political influence? Hay confirmed that there was some truth to this. Yvette said that was enough, and decided to go out for a bit of fresh air to calm down and collect her thoughts. Hay asked if she was going to take revenge. She replied that no, revenge was not the time. First, she needed to think through all the events, calm down, and prepare herself. She understood that Rukina's life was a web of betrayals and dangers. The poisoning attempt was probably not the last. In order to live peacefully, she needed to solve this problem once and for all. Yvette smiled slyly, feeling new strength within herself. Revenge is a matter of the future. Now is the time to prepare. She is still too naive, but when her time comes, those who despised her will fall to their knees before her. The next morning, Yvette was riding with her father in the carriage. The Duke was carefully examining the papers in his hands, his eyes fixed on the text. The drivers quietly guided the horses, and the morning air was filled with peace and the light, cool breath of a new day. Yvette decided on an important question and turned to her father. She wanted to know if he would support her if she decided to break off her engagement to the crown prince. The Duke was surprised by his daughter's unexpected proposal. His voice was calm, but with a hint of concern as he asked if something was wrong. Eve objected, simply because she was curious. She sensed that this was not an easy decision for her father. After all, his relationship with the emperor could be under threat, and the Duke's support was vital to her. The Duke replied that if his daughter really wanted it and made such a decision, he would be happy to support her. His words sounded sincere. Despite politics and intrigue, he would always be on her side. After all, she is his only daughter. Yvette smiled, feeling the warmth and support in that voice. She hugged her father, grateful for his understanding. Yvette's thoughts returned to the present. Although she had neither a lover nor real friends, she had a kind and reliable father. In the Duke of Rodolina's estate, in a room with large windows and soft light, Yvette felt angry at her body. She pinched her stomach, which seemed too big to her, and was disappointed in the reflection. Meanwhile, Sherry, her faithful maid, brought a yellow dress and offered to try it on. But Yvette flatly refused, ordering the dress to be taken away, saying she would never wear it again. Eve pointed to another smaller dress, hoping it would be easier. She felt a surge of strength and determination rising within her. She tried to put on her dress, but the zipper wouldn't close, which irritated her. Sherry offered to help, but Yvette proudly refused, even though she tried her best to squeeze into the tight clothes. Then Yvette gathered all the staff, the seamstress, the cook, the head maid, and the knight commander, who stood obediently on the first floor, watching the mistress of the manor with amazement. The girl spoke decisively and even threateningly. She appointed everyone as her personal nutritionist, her army in the plan to regain control over their bodies and lives. The lady made it clear that this was the beginning of a large, carefully planned revenge. Doubt and slight fear appeared in the eyes of those present, because they understood that the next 6 months would be a crucial time when Yvette would prepare for her new role and transformation. The training hall at Duke Rodellin's estate was filled with Yvette's labored breathing. She ran, but it was getting harder and harder for her. Her breathlessness was almost unbearable. The commander of the knights, the strict and uncompromising Joe, ordered him to take a wooden sword and practice striking it. At first, 80 times. Yvette fell to her knees, trying to catch her breath. She begged Joe to let her rest, but he ruthlessly increased the rate, now 85 beats. The Duchess felt fear and despair creeping up on her, but she refused to give up. The royal weight loss program she was prescribed was rigorous, consisting of grueling workouts and a strict diet. Joe strictly supervised every movement. Keep your back straight, do not relax. Yvette held the sword desperately, her body aching, but she obeyed. The next day, the number of sets would be increased by another 15. It sounded like a sentence. She would have to eat a lot of healthy food that she didn't like at all. She dreamed most of all of a meat and cheese pie, of a sweet cake with whipped cream. But now, it was just an unattainable fantasy. While Yvette struggled with hunger and muscle pain, Sherry enjoyed the cookies. She praised the Charleston chef, while Yvette looked at the sweets with sadness and saliva flowing from her mouth. When the girl asked for a little, her subordinates reacted negatively to her request. The head maid recalled that Yvette herself had stated that she would not look at sweets until she lost weight. This made the girl furious and desperate, but she did not give up. Sherry apologized for her colleague's behavior, but Yvette was stern. She didn't want anyone to make amends for her. It seemed that even the slightest show of sympathy was a burden to her. Suddenly, Hiram entered the hall. His appearance caused Yvette sharp feelings. She asked why he was here, not hiding her anger. The prince explained that he was simply worried about her health. Yvette replied coldly that she was not happy to see him. Hay, a little disappointed, leaned on one hand, trying to look casual. But the girl was suspicious that he was here at this very moment. The prince held out a box of blueberry muffins from Alfred's bakery, the new one in town. Sherry exclaimed with delight that the bakery was famous for its goodies and that he must have stood in line all afternoon. Yvette, looking at the box, couldn't contain her emotions and shouted for him to take it away. Hiram tried to explain that a few cupcakes during a strict diet were not a big deal, but the girl slammed her fist sharply on the table, turned around and left the room, leaving Hiram alone with his thoughts. Is Yvette on a diet again? How many times has she tried to lose weight, and how many times has it all ended in failure and shame? She's back to her old mistakes. This thought irritated Lexian. He didn't want his bride to question his name. He ordered Hay to stop this fight, saying that Yvette should finally give up and calm down. The younger brother understood that the matter was not easy, and cautiously replied that he supported his brother, but believed that everything was not so simple. One day, Yvette was walking in the garden and noticed Hay. He smiled at her, tenderly and affectionately, as if he were a sister, but the girl, not hiding her irritation, repeated his name, making it clear that this attention annoyed her. Hay announced that he was hosting a barbecue dinner that evening, trying to keep the conversation going. But Yvette exploded with anger, slammed her fist on the table, and asked sharply if it was time for him to go to the palace. He said the Duchess wanted to lose weight, and he was getting in her way. Hay tried to explain that he was worried about her health because she might get hurt. Yvette suggested that the reason was deeper and asked if Prince Lexian's order was behind all this. Hay flinched as if he had been caught doing something and tried to look innocent. The girl slammed her hand loudly on the table, then came closer and threatened that if he bothered her, she would break off all relations with him. Hay put his hands on hers, trying to calm her down, explaining that his brother's order was just the beginning. But now everything was different. However, before he could finish, Yvette abruptly threw his hands away and said goodbye. Hay was surprised. Just recently, it had been hard to believe in the girl's determination, as she had always loved to eat well. But within 2 weeks, he had seen a real change in her, and now he didn't want to bother her. At that moment, a servant brought a letter from the second prince. Hay! Opening the envelope, read the short message. The time has come. He threw the letter on the table, settled comfortably in his chair, and gazed thoughtfully at the sky, preparing himself for what was about to happen. Sherry was making Yvette's bed for bed, and as she folded the covers, she couldn't help but ask about her relationship with the third prince. She wondered if Yvette really hated Hiron now. Eve just smiled and tried to dismiss the idea, asking where the thought came from. Sherry explained that she noticed that when Hay is around, the lady is constantly angry, avoids talking, and asks to be told that she is not at home. This wasn't the case before they got along better. Eve wondered if it was that obvious. She tried to change the subject, jokingly raising the subject of whether it was okay to keep in touch with other men while engaged. But Sherry remarked that they would soon become a family, and shouldn't relatives get along with each other? Yvette's answer was reserved. Everything is much more complicated than it seems. Then the lady asked why the maid was so worried. She explained that she simply hoped for reconciliation, because Prince Heron was kind even to a simple maid, and she was grateful that Eve considered her a friend. Cherie's excitement turned into an apology for feeling unworthy to serve such a noble lady. Yvette gently patted her on the head and promised that she would remain her friend no matter what. After that, just before going to bed, Eve remembered Hiron. She thought about what he had wanted to say, but she brushed it aside. She thought she shouldn't worry about it, that he was just a spy for Lexion. Yvette decided to go to bed. But suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She thought it was Sherry. However, unexpectedly, the door was opened by Heron. The prince covered his mouth with his finger, warning that they might be overheard, and suggested they take a walk. Yvette sacré, and they went out into the duchy's garden. Hay said this was his third attempt to talk to her. She asked what he wanted to say. He said he would be returning to the palace tomorrow. Yvette replied indifferently that it was wonderful. The prince stroked her cheek and asked if she really wanted him to go. Hay leaned in as if to kiss her, but she turned her head away. Eve stood outside, holding back her irritation. She didn't understand why Hay was acting the way he did lately. His behavior seemed strange and sometimes obsessive to her. He reminded her that she had said she would not act until she did. But did that mean revenge was still in the plans? Eve made no secret of her determination. If Hay thought he could stop her, he was mistaken. But Hay only shook his head quietly and said he would always be there if she let him. This made Eve wonder, why was the second prince's younger brother so determined to be by her side? She sharply reminded him of his status, but he did not lose his composure. He hoped that she would achieve her goal, although sometimes he wanted to do things his own way, without restrictions. Without waiting for an answer, Hay walked away towards the estate, promising that he would soon take her to her room, as dawn had broken. Eve looked after him suspiciously, not trusting his good intentions. The next morning, Hay stood by the carriage, preparing to leave. Although he had not been at the estate long, it was time to say goodbye. The maids bowed, wished him a safe journey, and warned him to be careful. Eve stood nearby, watching silently. She called out to him in a friendly voice, "Have a safe journey, brother," but added in her mind, "and never come back." A smile appeared on her face, although she remained calm on the outside. Hay noticed her and quickly approached. Suddenly, he gave her a light tap on the head. The maids were shocked by this behavior. Eve grabbed her forehead in surprise and asked what he was doing. Hay jokingly replied that he just wanted to do it. Then he leaned into her ear and whispered something that made Eve blush not only on her forehead, but also on her cheeks. Before leaving, he wished her a happy stay. During the trip, Hay thought about Eve's words, and when she was left alone, she replayed his phrases in her head. "Forgive me, but don't overdo it. I like you the way you are." These words irritated her. She felt like Hay was just trying to get her. 6 months passed. At the Duke of Rodellion's estate, unexpected news arrived. The Duke had returned. His subordinates were surprised and filled with anxiety. One of the servants tried to inform him that Eve's was difficult to find, but the Duke was adamant. He was angrily scolding his subordinates for leaving them for a few months, and they had gone their separate ways. Suddenly, Eve's voice was heard. She appeared at the door. The Duke was stunned. His daughter looked completely different. She came down the stairs elegant, fragile, and radiant, like a completely different person, full of happiness and confidence. Her changes were noticeable, and even the stern Duke could not hide his pride. The Duchy of Winston was bathed in the soft light of evening when his aide approached the dark-haired Duke with a gloomy look. In his hands, he held a letter that had just arrived, first from the imperial court, then from headquarters, and now from the Rodolini estate. When the aide mentioned the name of Duke Rodolina, the man was surprised. He, like many others, was convinced that his daughter was dead. But, as the aide explained, the rumors turned out to be exaggerated. The girl, though near death, miraculously survived. The invitation was for a grand event, a grand banquet to celebrate Eve's full recovery and her engagement to the second crown prince, Lexian. The celebration was to take place 6 months after his recovery, and the delay was likely due to his long rehabilitation period. His younger brother, the third prince, was also expected to attend the event. The assistant suggested that he decline the invitation if the Duke did not wish to appear, but the Duke only smiled wryly. The time had come. He was to take part in the game he had planned regarding Duke Rodellin's daughter. At the Rodellin estate, Eve stood by the window and watched the carriages pull up at the entrance. Her face remained calm, but the fire of expectation shone in her eyes. She looked back at Sherry and asked if preparations for tomorrow's event were going smoothly. The maid, as always, was composed, but she couldn't hide her surprise. Was the lady really planning not to show herself until the ceremony itself? On the contrary, she would like to shine in front of the guests as soon as possible. Eve just smiled in response. The face of the event should only appear when everyone is gathered. That's when the impression will be strongest. She returned to her desk and reread the letter. It was about Logan. Eve sighed with relief. He was alive. But her thoughts were already turning in another direction. She had to secretly go to the village. The sly smile on her lips was the first sign of a plan. She looked at Sherry, her most loyal ally, and said that she would become her accomplice. And so began a little operation. Eve hid in a cart full of hay bales, while Sherry led it across the yard, pretending to be taking a load to the store. But when they were stopped by Urel, the head servant, they had to improvise. With her usual shrewdness, Sherry explained that she was carrying straw for the stuffed animals ordered from Torres. She spoke quickly, showering the lady with compliments, hinting that with such strength and character, Eves could have become a general if she were a man. Urel smiled, not suspecting anything. Finally, they reached the city safely. Sherry waited patiently while Eve changed. She looked completely different now, wearing simple pants, a dark cape, and her hair covered. She seemed like a young man, and that pleased her. It made it easier to remain unnoticed. Sherry, still alarmed, admitted that she had almost been exposed at the gate. and noted that it was a risky move for two women from the estate to venture into the city unguarded. But Eve was calm. She felt strong enough to stand up for herself. She even clenched her fist, proving that she looked like a man and no one would suspect anything. Cherie, charmed, agreed. Her mistress did indeed look fit and manly. Eve, on the other hand, was in no hurry to return to the estate. She suggested a stroll through the shops, lightly touching the maid's shoulder. And in this simple but sincere proposal, there was something more than a simple escape from home. In the shadows of the narrow streets of the shopping district, Eve and Sherry entered a jewelry store. Inside, chains, earrings, and pendants glittered, spread out on dark velvet. Eve was immediately captivated by the display of rings and suggested that her friend choose something to her liking. Sherry tried to refuse, but Eve insisted. She wanted to make her feel good. The salesman, seeing this scene, enthusiastically supported the gesture of generosity, encouraging her to buy anything she wanted. Eve stopped at a silver pendant with a blue stone and asked the price. The seller valued the jewelry at 30 gold pieces, adding with a smile that he would make a discount for the beloved. Eve, without wasting time, answered confidently, "No more than 15." The seller froze in doubt. He tried to defend at least 27. But the girl did not give up. She drew attention to the simplicity of the decoration, doubted the authenticity of the stone, and resolutely pressed the interlocutor. The bargain was concluded on her terms. The gift moved Sherry to tears. She thanked him sincerely, assuring him that she would treasure it. Eve just shrugged, grumbling that the stone was fake and that she would give a better one later. But for the maid, it wasn't the cost that mattered. It was the gesture itself, the attention she so rarely received. But the calm warmth of the moment was shattered by a scream that echoed across the street. The voice of a lady reached the shop, screaming at a woman with a child. Standing by the ice cream stand was Elise, Marchioness Millick, furious that the boy had accidentally soiled her dress. In front of her, with her shoulders slumped, stood her mother Emma, trying to calm little Jackson. A crowd had already gathered around. People were whispering. Some pitied the boy and his mother. Others complained about the children's poor manners. Some said that the Marquise herself was to blame, for she had suddenly gone out into the street and bumped into the child. But most, though sympathetic, did not have the courage to intervene. Ellis, seething with anger, turned to Viscount Barclay, who was standing nearby. She ordered him to immediately punish the culprits by cutting off their hands. This order stunned not only the Viscount, but everyone present. But the lady was relentless. The dress, they said, was a gift from the second prince, and there would be no forgiveness. Mother and son shuddered, filled with tears, unable to believe the reality of what was happening. Barclay, though hesitant, had already drawn his sword and approached them, saying that this event would remain a painful lesson for them for the rest of their lives. And at that very moment, Eves emerged from the crowd. She quickly rushed forward and covered the mother and child with her. Her hand confidently held the sword. She stood between the Viscount's blade and the defenseless. Barclay stopped. His gaze was filled with surprise and irritation. Eve met his gaze coldly and firmly. There was no doubt or fear in her eyes. Now she was not just the Duke's daughter. She had become someone who would prevent the weak from being harmed. Eve still stood with her sword raised, shielding Emma and her son, her eyes burning with indignation, her body tense, ready for battle. Viscount Berkeley grimaced in confusion, unaccustomed to resistance from women, and even from commoners, it seemed to him. Instead, she turned her attention to the screaming woman next to her. Elise, who introduced herself as the only daughter of the Marquise Millick, was screaming in her usual way, almost spitting with anger. Her indignation seemed to know no bounds. But Eve did not flinch. She calmly reminded him, "These lands belong to the Duke of Rodelien, and any form of lynching is forbidden here." And the act that the Marquise had just attempted to commit was contempt for the Duke's authority. Her words were picked up by people in the crowd. Someone mentioned that all the inhabitants of these lands have the right to protection against gross arbitrariness, even from the aristocrats. Elise, without holding back, rushed to Eve, showing the stain on the dress, which she considered invaluable. But Eve replied with an icy smile that this dress didn't suit her from the very beginning, and the luxurious outfit on her shoulders was like pearls on a pig's neck. The crowd gasped, and Ellis, overcome with emotion, swayed theatrically and, feigning fainting, almost fell into the Viscount's arms. Her movements were so smooth that even Eve couldn't help but note her acting skills. Suddenly, Berkeley lunged at Eve with his sword. She managed to parry the first blow. There was no longer any contempt in his voice, only anger and fear. He demanded that Eve identify herself, outraged that she had interfered in the affairs of the nobility. In his eyes, Eve was an impostor, not an equal. Eve dodged, but the forces were unequal. Although she was skillful with the sword, she was inferior in weight and experience. In the crowd, Duke Winston silently watched the duel. His gaze followed every movement. He could see that this girl was not a professional, but she was persistently honing each technique. Her movements showed determination. Next to him stood a red-haired man who silently noted that the boy the Viscount had been fighting was already exhausted. He was about to be knocked off his feet. At the critical moment, Eve's sword flew out of her hands and fell to the cobblestones. It froze. Berkeley raised his weapon, preparing for the final blow. But before he could do so, a thin, thrown blade struck his hand, as accurate as an arrow. The Viscount groaned and clutched at the wound. There was a movement in the crowd. A dark-haired man in a long dark cloak stepped forward. It was Duke Winston. His voice was calm and commanding. He ordered Berkeley to take the Marquis Millick and return to the palace immediately. The latter was stunned. He did not argue, he just sighed, ordered Ellis to support him, and hastily left the square. The crowd whispered. Eve was breathing heavily when Emma approached her with the baby. The woman thanked her with a smile. Eve gently patted Jackson on the head, reminded him not to cause any more trouble, and asked him to apologize to his mother. The boy nodded obediently. Cherie ran up to the girl, excited and confused. She threw herself into her arms with tears, reproaching her for her carelessness. Eve gently reassured her. Everything was fine with her. Meanwhile, Duke Winston came closer, holding the sword of Eve in his hands. He looked carefully at the girl and said with a faint smile that she interested him. Her reaction was mixed: surprise, indignation, mild embarrassment. She tried to get closer to get a better look at him, but tripped. The man picked her up. She blushed and thanked him, but in a moment she regained her composure. She stepped back and asked what it all meant. The Duke calmly replied, with such skills, she would not last long. His tone was not mocking, but rather a warning. Eve stared at him silently, not yet knowing who this man really was. But one thing was clear: this meeting would change her more than she could have imagined. Eve was burning with irritation. Her movements became increasingly aggressive as she struck the scarecrow again and again. The sharp blade cut through the air with a fury born not only of defeat, but also of the bitter echo of other people's words. Finally, with a dry crack, the sword cut the scarecrow in half. Duke Winston's words rang in her head like a bell. "You won't live long with such skills, ma'am." They haunted her. She could no longer ignore the truth hidden behind the irony of his voice. The loss left a prickly mark on her. Anger mingled with a deep determination. She had to become stronger. And it wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Ethan stood nearby, watching her movements intently. His comment was unexpected but accurate. Her hands were unusual, and the position in which she held the sword could hardly have been comfortable for an ordinary person. But Eve had her own story. In a past life, she was a national fencer. Her body remembered other battles, other victories. And although the circumstances were different now, the habit of holding the blade remained unchanged. Commander Ethan, who was observing the training, also noticed her uneasiness. His question was soft but precise. Something was bothering her more than usual. Eve did not hide her doubts. She asked him directly, "Is it possible for a girl to win a fight against adult, experienced men? Is there a strategy for that?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His words were measured. If there is a big difference in skill between opponents, and emotions, fear or uncertainty prevail, there is almost no chance. But there was a way out. It lay at the very foundation of the art of the sword. Eve listened carefully. She knew that the title of swordmaster was not just an honorary title. This is the pinnacle of swordsmanship, and only a few have ever achieved it. Such warriors are able to use mana in battle, the energy that unites body, will, and spirit. There were only two such masters in the entire empire. One of them was her father, Duke Radelin. The other was Duke Winston, the same one who had recently saved her and thrown her into the abyss of doubt. He was the youngest to hold the title. Ethan added that Eve had a unique trait, an innate ability to use mana, but she just sighed. Perhaps she had mana, but she didn't know how to use it properly. And it's quite possible that she missed her chance. The commander agreed, but he reassured her. She was not alone. She had Carlton, an experienced knight, by her side, and he himself was her mentor and protector. Eve's thought about it. Real talents always have a chance, even if it seems minimal. At that moment, one of the knights came up and announced that a message had come from the village. The blacksmith had finished working on the commander's sword. Ethan was about to leave immediately, but Eve stopped him with a request. Let her take her sword too. Eve and Cherie set off for the village again. The maid, like last time, felt constrained and a little anxious, but she walked silently beside them. Their path led them to a familiar smithy. It was warm inside and smelled of hot metal. The blacksmith, seeing the newly arrived young man, raised an eyebrow, but silently accepted the note that was handed to him. Looking into it, he immediately understood what they had come for. Within a minute, he had brought a long, wrapped object from the back room. Unfolding the cloth, he proudly presented the sword. The blade gleamed with a cold sheen, and the handle was a deep wine color. Its shape and balance showed the work of a craftsman. Eve looked at it with admiration. She carefully took the sword in her hands, easily passing it through the air. The blade obediently cut through space. The movements were clear, as if the sword were an extension of her hand. The blacksmith watched it with pride. It was his finest creation, and he made no secret of it. The sword was called Orion, a weapon into which he had invested not only his skills, but also a part of his own soul. The Duchess once again assessed the balance and lightness, then raised the blade upwards, as if making a promise. This sword would become her ally. After the forge, Eve and Cherie decided to rest at a local tavern. The atmosphere was modest but cozy. The maid glanced cautiously at the menu, not believing that she could really choose anything she wanted. Eve just smiled and nodded, allowing her to let her go. But after a moment, Eve's gaze slid towards the table by the window. There were two men sitting there. One of them was a relaxed-looking redhead. The other was the same stranger who had recently intervened in the duel with Viscount Berkeley. Eve stood up abruptly. Winston, the Duke, was listening to his companion, who was saying something about some organizer who did not appear in public. But his thoughts were interrupted when an unfamiliar girl in a cloak approached the table. The Duke's gaze was calm and cold, while the redhead immediately jumped, grabbing the hilt of his sword. Eve stopped in front of them with a smile. She apologized for her intrusion, explaining that she had simply wanted to thank him. The Duke recognized her as the same young man from the market. He was surprised, although he did not show it. Eve, without hesitation, offered him her service. She wanted to thank him for saving her life. Winston calmly waved it away, noting that he was having lunch now. And this is a completely inappropriate moment for justice to be served. Without waiting for an answer, Eve leaned over and grabbed his fork, sticking it in her mouth. She savored the Duke's food as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Both men were momentarily stunned, even Winston's expression of surprise. After a few calm movements, Eve removed the cloak from her head, revealing her true face. Her voice was clear. This meeting was no coincidence, and she intended to serve him. In the warm, cozy hall of the rural establishment, a roast boar gleamed on the table. The hearty dinner was still smoking, filling the air with spicy smells. Eve was admiring the dishes, and sitting next to her were Duke Winston, his companion Dmitri, and the quiet, soft-spoken Sherry, who was smiling shyly. Eve happily shared the dish with her maid, insisting that she try the pork, which was famous throughout the district. She jokingly threatened that Sherry would regret it for the rest of her days if she didn't try at least a bite. Having cut the meat, Eve herself put a juicy piece into her mouth. The pleasure was so obvious that she sighed with pleasure. In such moments, even dozens of grueling workouts can be endured. Winston watched the girl with some surprise. She was too free for an aristocrat. Her manner seemed bold, even carefree at times. But her appearance and demeanor were clearly of noble birth. The way Sherry addressed her only confirmed the Duke's suspicions. Eve, realizing her mistake, covered her face with her hand and giggled briefly. She didn't object, calling herself Eve. The Duke instead responded with an assumed name, Rappel. The exchange of pleasantries took place discreetly, without excessive formality, but subtly, with wary curiosity. Rappel quickly got to the point. He was curious about what purpose had brought the girl to him. Eves did not answer immediately. At first, she tried to reduce everything to simple curiosity. She wanted to see the difference between Viscount Berkeley's public mask and his true face. But the Duke did not believe in the naivety of her intentions. He emphasized that her actions were reckless. Out of mere curiosity, she exposed herself to danger without hiding her belonging to a higher class. In a world like this, it's a risk. His words involuntarily brought Eve back to memories of the recent battle and to the phrase that still echoed in her head, "You won't live long with such skills." The girl asked if that was what he meant then, and if he intended to apologize now. The Duke responded evasively, raising another suggestion. Perhaps she was trying to learn his identity so she could pursue him later. Eve laughed. Her reaction was sincere and open. She admitted that her actions were reckless, but at that moment, she had no choice. She simply lacked the skills to handle it on her own. Rappel looked at her carefully. He was interested not only in her determination, but also in the fact that such a young noble lady wielded a sword at a fairly decent level. Where did such skill come from? Why? And how did she remain calm in the face of a strong opponent? Eve was silent for a moment. Then she shrugged and answered briefly. This time, she intended to survive. There was more to those words than just motivation. They were her choice, her inner decision. She explained that she wanted to live in peace and freedom. Owning a sword became her key to safety, the ability to protect herself and those she valued. The Duke stared into her eyes silently, as if trying to see deeper. His gaze finally warmed, and he said that, although he did not fully understand her motives, he recognized a good soul in her. He liked this softness. That's why he made an unexpected offer, to join his knightly detachment. Rappel admitted, she had no luck with her rival in the market. Her actions were dangerous, perhaps even senseless. But her courage was undeniable. He wiped his lips with a handkerchief, stood up, and briefly announced that dinner was over. Eve looked at him. One thought was running through her head. He was scolding her, analyzing her, questioning her, and then praising her. But he never answered her main question. Eve lay relaxed in a bath of rose petals. The scent of the flowers enveloped her body, calming her tense thoughts. Sherry reported that Ethan had led the patrol, Charles and Uriel were finishing their preparations, and Mirai was on her way. Prince Lexion and Ellis had recently arrived. Eve stood up, pulled on a silk robe, and headed for the exit. There was no doubt in her eyes. The time had come. The prelude to revenge was beginning. The Duke of Rodolino's banquet hall was filled with elegant guests. The atmosphere radiated solemnity. The crystal glow of the chandeliers, the music, the calm, sonorous hum of conversation. Prince Hay slowly glanced around the hall, searching for a familiar face. Lexion, who was standing nearby, made an ironic comment, but Hay only smiled sheepishly. The elder brother continued in his spirit, mocking Yvette's absence and recalling how she had declined his invitation. The prince seemed unable to accept this slight. Nearby, Ellis, seemingly sincere and sweet, was showing her excitement. She said she was worried about her dear friend, Mosyun, who had organized this evening. But every word she said was laced with hypocritical condescension. Lexion responded to her with theatrical tenderness, with feigned adoration, promising marriage and fame. Hay, silently watching this performance, only sighed. His gaze said, neither one nor the other is worthy of the one they despise. Suddenly, an unusual guest appeared in the hall, a tall man in a mask. The guests immediately whispered warily. It was Duke Winston, known as the ghostly, legendary and mysterious. His appearance caused a wave of surprise. The princes cast cold glances at him, and Lexion tried to start a conversation, hinting at the ignored invitation. The Duke, calm and defiantly aloof, did not answer directly. His refusal caused the prince to burst into a fit of rage. Winston kept his cool, easily deflecting the attack, and in a moment he disappeared into the crowd, uttering a single farewell phrase about tired masks. His indifference only added fuel to the fire of the prince's pride. At that moment, the butler raised his voice, announcing the main character of the evening. Yvette appeared in the hall, calm and imperturbable, like the shadow of a queen returned to her own. Her black dress was elegant and voluminous, with perfectly cut lines. A strand of hair was pinned back at the back of her head. The rest fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She walked slowly, with dignity, radiating a confidence that scattered around the room like hot sparks. Ellis froze with her mouth open, and Lexian, seeing Eve, could not contain his surprise. His eyes widened. He did not recognize in this woman the one he despised so much. The guests who had just been gossiping were now silent. Their gazes were fixed on her as if enchanted. Some could not even believe that she was really the daughter of Duke Rodelin. Yvette briefly addressed the audience. Her voice was even, calm, like an echo in the palace halls. She thanked them for their presence and invited them to enjoy the evening. Her smile was restrained but flawless, just enough to give the impression of absolute control. The reaction was immediate. The guests whispered in amazement. Some admired her dress. Others couldn't believe that she had changed so much. The ladies asked about her beauty secrets. The men readily invited her to dance. Exclamations of admiration poured in one after another. She outshone everyone. Ellis noticed that even Viscount Berkeley did not take his eyes off Eve, and this only added to her anger. When she heard the guests mention the change in the balance of power in social circles, her fists clenched. She suddenly felt awkward and unnecessary. Ellis's gaze slid to Lexion. He was silent, but his eyes were burning with anger. He was upset that Eve didn't pay attention to him, that she dared to smile at others, flirt, as if she didn't owe him anything. Ellis felt everything slipping from her grasp. The best salons, a lucrative fiancé, the promise of an imperial crown. Everything she considered hers now paled in comparison to the image of Yvette. And Eve herself, without pausing, cast a brief, cold glance at her. It was empty and indifferent, like an empty hall after a ball. Inside, the Duchess noted, a crack had appeared. This was the beginning. The first step of revenge had been taken. Yvette felt a mixture of peace and anxiety. She went through a strict diet for the sake of cold revenge and the desire for a comfortable life. The party went off without any major problems, but she knew a new challenge lay ahead. The men in the room kept following her, showering her with compliments and trying to ask her to dance. Such attention was a surprise, and, noticing her father among the guests, Yvette tried to hint that he should intervene and save her from the unwanted noise. Soon, Hay approached her, said a reserved hello, and extended his hand with an offer to dance. However, their meeting was interrupted by Duke Winston, who unexpectedly also invited Yvette to dance. She looked at the masked man in surprise, but accepted his invitation anyway. The music started, and they began to circle smoothly in the center of the hall. Yvette thought that it was Duke Winston hiding behind the mask. She did not understand why he had accepted her invitation and why he had done so now. He whispered that she was not what the rumors described her to be. She responded with restraint, taking it as a compliment. As they danced, Lexian stood aside, his face full of malice. Winston, who accompanied Yvette, said quietly that he would wait for their next meeting. Yvette recognized his voice and blushed a little. At that moment, Lexian exclaimed in confusion, accusing Winston of flirting with his fiancée. The Duchess was surprised, but she played along, as if a little upset, admitting that she had been waiting a long time for her brother to ask her to dance. Lexian assured her that he had never forgotten her and was happy when she woke up. Yvette thought about his quick reaction, comparing him to a faithful dog. She asked Lexian to grant her request, to dance with her all evening. The prince promised that he would dance only with her. Yvette accepted his hand, feigning joy. Ellis, watching this, was furious, but tried to keep her emotions under control. She turned to Yvette with a question about her beauty and the legitimacy of her admiration. Yvette smiled and thanked Ellis, calling her a dear friend, remaining confident and in control of the situation in this delicate confrontation. Yesterday's event was remembered at the Rodelian estate as an incredible event. Sherry, who could not hide her delight, said that all the guests had gathered precisely for Yvette. She noticed that she was even more excited than the Duchess. Sherry was looking forward to today's hunting competition. The knight who would be the first to shoot the white deer was to become the winner and dedicate his victory to the most beautiful lady, giving her the sign of victory. Sherry was convinced that all the knights would seek to pay their respects to Yvette. It seemed both exciting and romantic to her. However, Yvette herself felt tired as she sat on the couch. She knew that people's opinions could easily change based on their appearance, and she was not thrilled about it. The maid noticed the gloomy expression and picked up the gift with the envelope, which turned out to be from Berkeley. She jokingly noted that everyone was falling in love with her mistress, and now Yvette would be very busy. Yvette winced at the mention of Berkeley, but Sherry continued to bring other gifts. She particularly noted a bouquet of white roses, a rare gift from Winston in these parts. This showed how much he was struck by Yvette's beauty. That girl didn't want to think about it seriously. A sudden knock on the door broke the silence. Sherry went to open it and saw Heron, the third crown prince, standing there, warmly greeting Yvette and the maid. Hay and Yvette walked around the estate. He joked that she was a heartbreaker, even though she herself thought they didn't have one. They smiled at each other, and Hay wondered if Yvette had previously known Duke Winston, and if he was related to his brother. Yvette avoided answering, not wanting to broach the subject. It was early in the morning, and she offered to accompany the prince to the palace. Hay assured her that he had no ill intentions, but simply wanted to see her. Yvette felt a slight unease, thinking of his charming appearance and the possible pretty face attack. Eve noted that sometimes it seems as if there is a black veil over Hea, as if he is an ordinary person, but he is behind many important events. The prince agreed, but did not reveal his secrets. They argued, and Hay proposed a competition. Whoever reached the end of the corridor first would be able to grant the loser a wish. Eve refused, but the prince had already run. She shouted at him with all her might to stop. At this moment, Duke Winston stood quietly behind the wall, watching their conversation, unnoticed. The hunting competition began amidst meadows and splendor. Tents were lined up along the open area, and the participants stood on horseback next to them. Nearby, under silken canopies, noble ladies sat watching the preparations. Lexion was already sitting in the saddle, impassive and solemn, as befits a true heir. Ellis, smiling excitedly, gestured to her little brother for success. Lexion responded with a slight wave of his hand, and their gazes met in silent understanding. Eve sat a little to the side, silent but attentive to every movement on the field. One of the participants thought that Eve looked like a red rose in bloom that day. Another, smiling wryly, mocked how suddenly everyone noticed her beauty, as if she had appeared out of nowhere. Lexion just shrugged, not hiding his attitude. He had always seen her this way, beautiful, even before others began to see anything special in her. One of the men tried to justify himself, saying that it was just a tribute to the Duchess's beauty. But the prince did not want to listen any longer. In his eyes, she was always unsurpassed, without needing external approval. Meanwhile, Duke Winston rode into the arena. The two men's gazes met, attentive, wary, full of implication. Lexion was slightly surprised by his appearance. The Duke usually avoided such events, preferring weapons to social entertainment, especially those where, instead of a sword, he used a heavily ornamented hunting bow. However, Winston answered not with words, but with a sly smile. He declared that he intended to prove his superiority, and if he won, he promised to give Eve a rose. The challenge was hidden behind calm contempt. Lexion rode on, his thoughts revolving around Duke Winston's words. That uninvited, sly smile and the hint of a rose for Yvette kept coming back to his memory. The prince felt anger rising in his chest. Winston's tone, his gaze, everything indicated a hidden challenge. When he reached the waterhole, Lexion dismounted, knelt, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Looking up, he saw Winston standing there. The Duke was drawing his bowstring. His gaze was fixed on the white stag, the rare prey that could bring victory. Lexion tensed instantly. His hands reached for his quiver. The thought that Winston would receive the main trophy was unbearable. Lex's gaze slid back towards his opponent. His hand was already reaching out to aim. It could all be explained by an unfortunate coincidence. Hunting does not tolerate the weak. But as soon as the string of his bow was drawn, Winston abruptly changed position. The target was no longer the deer. The arrow flew straight into the prince's head. Lexion's impulsive cry shattered the silence of the forest. At the same time, at the table for the noble ladies, a completely different struggle was going on. Silent, refined, and poisonous. Ellis was showing off the fan, jewelry, and bracelets given to her by her brother. It all sounded playful, but the tone of her voice hinted at more. Eve remained calm, her gaze steady, her movements restrained. The ladies around him politely admired Lexion's generosity, but behind the compliments was curiosity and a desire to hear more. Ellis had casually mentioned that Lex loved her immensely, even more than his own fiancée. It sounded too sincere to be accidental. Eve answered quietly, with dignity. She admitted that she was unable to control her own feelings, and that Ellis's beauty was indeed enviable. But it didn't sound like a concession, more like a calculation. The tension was growing. The other ladies began to intervene, reminding him that Yvette was His Highness's bride. Their words cut through the silence like a cold blade. Ellis tried to maintain a calm expression, but her smile was trembling. Eve responded with polite theatricality, like an actress who had learned her part well. Some had already begun to openly admire her. Her kindness seemed boundless. But behind this softness lay steel. Yas saw it all. Ellis's hypocrisy, her manipulation, her convenient role as bridesmaid as a cover. All of this only emphasized one thing. The current hand was no longer a puppet. Ellis paled. The realization of defeat grew inside her like poison. And Eve, covering her face with her hand, hid a smile, not mocking, but triumphant. She knew she had won. At that moment, one of the soldiers ran up to them, his face distorted with horror. The news of the prince's injury came as a shock. Even Eve could not contain her surprise. All eyes turned towards the forest, where a completely different battle had just been decided. Lexion sat in the tent, holding back his irritation. His arm was tightly bandaged, the white bandage contrasting sharply with the dark fabric of his clothes. The doctor calmly assured him that everything would be fine, a simple sprain, no complications if he followed the treatment regimen. However, for the prince, such weakness was humiliating. Ellis burst into the tent, pale, agitated, her eyes full of anxiety. She rushed to her brother, demanding an explanation. Her words were full of regret and indignation. How could such recklessness have been allowed? Who would have allowed the heir to be injured? Lexion tried to calm her down, but each attempt only fueled her emotions. Roy wanted to say something, but the prince stopped him, not wanting it to escalate into a farce. A few minutes later, Eve appeared in the tent. Her face was serious. Her voice was quiet but sincere. She stood next to the prince, barely holding back her tears, and asked him to reassure her that everything would pass. This concern touched Lex more than he could admit. He saw genuine concern in her eyes, not ostentatious, not put on display. But Ellis suddenly took the conversation in a different direction. She began to accuse Eve of negligence. Everything should have been checked in advance, and an organizational error had caused the injury. Her words sounded remarkably caring, but there was a hint of reproach disguised as advice. Eve took it in stride, although inside she was seething. She understood that Ellis was trying to make her guilty for someone else's mistake. But while she was silent, a calm voice came from behind her. Duke Winston took the blame. He explained that Lex had been attacked by a deer that he had not shot in time. Although the animal was neutralized, one of the arrows had struck the prince. The situation seemed absurd, but that's exactly what turned out to be true. An accident while hunting. Some of the people present whispered behind their backs, "How could you be scared of a simple deer?" Lex heard these words and could barely contain his anger. Ellis's attempts to steer the conversation back to regret were unsuccessful. The prince suddenly exploded. He was disgusted by all this attention, this conversation, this crowding. He demanded that everyone leave the tent immediately and continue the competition. The hunt ended in victory for Duke Winston. He returned with the white stag, dismounted, took out a rose-shaped pendant, and solemnly presented it to Eve. His gesture was impeccable, stable, noble. Eve smiled slightly and accepted the gift, not hiding her surprise. The Duke's eyes were staring straight into her soul. Eve couldn't read what exactly was on his mind, and that worried her more than anything. All the attention of those around her was riveted on them. Quiet comments flew around, some of them too frank. The only one who could not hide his rage was the second hereditary prince, Lexion. In the evening, already at the estate, he broke a glass, unable to contain his emotions. Roy, as always, silently got up to remove the glass, but Lex deliberately stepped on his hand, driving the pieces into his skin. Everything inside the prince was boiling. Winston had not only touched his bride, he had publicly violated her. Roy endured the pain, and as his hand trembled and bled, the prince gave a curt command: "Prepare." There was work ahead, and there was not a shadow of doubt left in his eyes. Silence reigned in the residence of the Duke of Rodelin, broken only by the night rustle of the garden. Eves, clutching a letter in her hand, cautiously went out into the courtyard. It contained a short message: "I'll see you at midnight, under the hawthorn bush in the garden." Her thoughts wavered between suspicion and hope. This meeting could finally show how far what was once called trust had come. She was just heading towards the indicated place when someone suddenly touched her shoulder. A sharp turn, and the figure of Duke Winston appeared before her. His appearance seemed too out of place to her, but he looked calm as always. He said he had gone out for some fresh air. This answer did not inspire confidence. Eve tried to wave him away, demanding that he leave her alone, but the Duke was in no hurry to leave. He looked at her with that slight, mocking expression she had come to hate. Eve whispered not to disturb him, but he said he could not let her wander the garden alone. In his opinion, it was a worthy escort mission. She didn't have time to react when Lex approached the bushes. He looked focused, clearly waiting for someone. Eve froze in tension. They might be exposed. However, the situation unexpectedly became even more complicated. Prince Hay appeared behind him. He looked at Winston in surprise, not understanding what was happening here. Eve hurriedly gestured for him to be quiet, but instead he sat down next to her, as if joining in on an evening stroll. Now she found herself between two men who were looking at each other with distrust. Hay tried to look reserved, though his voice was filled with jealousy. He wondered what the Duke was doing alone with Eve at this late hour. He calmly replied that he had come across Madame Rodelin by chance and had decided to continue the conversation. His words contained a hint that Hay was all too well informed about Eve's presence in the garden. The glances exchanged between the two men became even more intense. Both men tried to keep the upper hand in the conversation. This irritated Eve. The whole scene felt more like a comedy than the observation of a secret meeting. Finally, she pushed them both away slightly and warned them that if they didn't leave or shut up, she would curse them both for eternity. At that moment, a familiar call came from the bushes. Lexion was calling Ellis. Eve recognized the voice instantly and lowered her voice. Winston, leaning towards her, asked if this was the same Mrs. Millick. No answer was needed. It was all obvious. Ellis approached Lex with the ease that always distinguished her. Her voice was soft, full of mock remorse. She assured him that she had been worried about him and regretted her words. Lex responded with restraint. But when Ellis mentioned their nighttime encounter, the prince immediately reminded her how risky their situation was. Ellis laughed and pointed out that Eve wouldn't know anything anyway. The words stung Eve, but at the same time they confirmed what she had suspected. Her presence here had not been in vain. Lex noticed that things had become more difficult since Eve had woken up. Ellis couldn't help but tear up. She blamed Lex for the change in his attitude towards her. Her words became sharp, filled with pain and jealousy. She declared that Eve had cast a spell on him, that it had all been a temporary replacement from the start. Lex, trying to calm her down, hugged the girl and gently touched her face. Then he leaned down and kissed her, as an apology, as an attempt to maintain balance in something that had long lost its harmony. And a few steps away in the darkness, Eve stood, her fingers clenched into fists. There was no room left in her heart for either surprise or regret, only silence, growing cold. Eve watched the kissing scene with an inward grin. Her gaze was sharp, her heart like a compressed spring. It all seemed too showy, too theatrical, even for Ellis. Duke Winston, standing a little to the side, also did not hide his surprise. It seemed to him that Madame Rodelin already knew what was happening, otherwise she would hardly have remained so calm. Even for him, this scene seemed overly emotional. Lexion, looking into Ellis's eyes, once again assured her of his devotion. In response, she set a condition: to win tomorrow's race and ask her for the handkerchief in front of everyone. It was supposed to be a symbol of their relationship. The prince hesitated because it meant public recognition, but Ellis insisted. She couldn't trust him without it. Everything inside Eve is boiling. The handkerchief, presented in front of the crowd, will be the perfect trump card. Lex will appear loyal, but in reality, this act will turn against him. She felt this was her chance, the perfect moment to launch an offensive. After the pair disappeared into the darkness of the garden, Hay, Eve, and Winston stood there. Silence returned. Eve smiled faintly. What was supposed to be proof of Lex's love turns into his trap. Then Winston broke his silence. He admitted that he had interfered in matters that did not concern him and apologized. Eve answered calmly. She did not object as long as the Duke remained silent. Winston promised to help. The gesture made her wary, but she nodded silently. The Duke recalled details he had noticed earlier. Eve's words that she would survive this time, and Ellis's phrase about the need to double the dose of medication. All of this prompted conclusions. He quickly put these fragments together and concluded that the situation surrounding Eve's awakening was not as simple as it seemed. Eve appreciated his observation. She knew that aristocrats were strict about such things, especially when it came to the romance of the heir to the throne with a noble girl. Winston assured that by interfering in this game, he was simply fulfilling his duty to the Empire. She agreed to cooperate. He was to appear at the main entrance of the Rodellan residence tomorrow morning, properly dressed. They needed to find out more. Eve smiled and waved goodbye. She knew that even the best-laid plans change along the way, but these changes can also be turned to your advantage. Hay sat silently beside her, hugging his knees. He didn't interfere, he just watched, and his silence spoke more than any words. Eve understood. Now it was important not to miss any opportunity. She turned to Hay and quietly asked if they could talk alone. Their conversation was not yet over. The next morning, Duke Winston stood at the entrance to the building, impeccably dressed. His bearing and elegance could not fail to be noticed by the ladies who passed by. They turned, slightly averting their gaze, although they tried to do it imperceptibly. As Eve approached, an almost imperceptible tension grew between them. The Duke greeted her with a slight smile, and she responded with cold politeness. He wondered when exactly she had guessed who he really was. The girl noted that she recognized him almost immediately, and what he said last night only confirmed her suspicions. Winston had no choice but to admit defeat. He asked that his secret be kept as he enjoyed remaining unnoticed in society. In response, Eve put forward a counter-condition: silence about their nighttime encounter. The Duke agreed, adding that it turned out to be more interesting than he had thought. Eve smiled and said that it was quite nice to get attention after 6 months of strict dieting. She called it a small victory. The Duke, listening intently, remarked that any revenge he had seen had ultimately left only devastation in its wake. But Eve explained that for her, revenge was not an end, but a means. She longed for a peaceful and happy life. She talked about her dreams: to visit a resort area, go beyond the limits of her diet, visit the best restaurants, and perhaps even be knighted. She had owned a sword since childhood, and did not see anything unattainable in it. The Duke suggested that it would suit her. Eve was surprised. He had recently doubted her abilities. Winston admitted that her stubbornness and determination were truly worthy of respect. He wondered how far she could go. Eve turned, hiding a smile. She was not often praised, especially by those who preferred to keep their distance. The Duke, watching her reaction, couldn't help but laugh a little. After a short pause, he asked what she really wanted. Eve replied that she had only 3 wishes. The first was to pretend to others that they were close. Winston immediately understood that this was necessary for a third party, and she confirmed that it was for that very purpose. The second request concerned his participation in the horse race that day. She asked him to withdraw from it. Winston thought for a moment, for it was not an easy matter. However, Eve clarified that he must be present at the festive dinner because she needed a witness. Then he asked about the third point. Eve admitted that this request was the most important. She promised to be grateful if the matter became public. She would need help when the truth came to the surface. She wanted to know what was really going on. The girl leaned over and whispered something. When she straightened up, she asked if it would be possible. The Duke replied that if the situation were indeed revealed, it would inevitably fall within his authority. Eve sighed in relief. The answer was exactly what she had hoped for. The tournament, organized by Duke Rodolino, was coming to an end. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was waiting for the final battle. His Highness, the second Prince of Lexian, and Spencer Tyler, the youngest son of Duke Tyler, entered the fray first. The audience held their breath. Eve watched the action from the stands, hiding a smile behind her fan. She was truly excited about the finale, as the outcome could have been unexpected. One of the young ladies sitting nearby asked about Duke Winston's absence. Eve replied, without emotion, that he had to leave urgently. The young lady sighed. The absence of the favorite was felt. Ellis abruptly intervened, boldly declaring that the Duke's presence would not have changed anything. In her opinion, the victory belonged to Lex anyway. This statement caused restrained surprise among those around her. Someone expressed doubt whether the prince could defeat a true swordsman. Marquise Mielik turned sharply on the girl, accusing her of disrespecting the royal family. The discussion became heated. The older lady tried to calm the Marquise by noting that others were entitled to their own opinions. But Ellis responded defiantly, promising that everyone would still ask her for forgiveness when she got what others couldn't even dream of. Her words sounded like a challenge. Eve watched the scene silently, hiding a smile behind her fan. She realized that Ellis had completely lost her caution, believing too much in the power of her position. This haste could play a cruel joke on her. Meanwhile, enthusiastic cheers rose from the crowd. The Crown Prince appeared in the arena, and the audience greeted him with applause. The participants were ordered to take their places. Lex and Spencer engaged in a duel. The sounds of weapons clashing echoed in the air, but it didn't last long. Spencer quickly gave in. The judge announced the winner, and the stands erupted in applause. The women were shouting the prince's name enthusiastically, and some were already glancing triumphantly at their friends. It all ended as Ellis had expected. On the podium, Cecilia enthusiastically noted that the day promised to be no less bright than yesterday, and added that Eve's would once again be the center of attention. Some nearby sighed. The envy was obvious. Ellis, hearing these words, clenched her handkerchief tightly in her fingers. Something predatory flashed in her gaze. She watched Eve with contempt and cold determination. In her mind, everything was already decided. Today, she would be the only one in charge. Eve, in her opinion, would be left with regret and humiliation. The Marquise's eyes flashed as she contemptuously looked away from her friend, convinced that she no longer deserved even sympathy. Lex solemnly walked to the balcony and extended his hand towards the podium. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. Ellis watched his every move intently, her thoughts still spinning malicious ideas. The insulting words she repeated to herself over and over again still echoed in her mind. If Eve had remained the same stupid fat woman, none of this would have happened. But Lex's next gesture made her heart clench with pain. The prince turned to Eve, asking her for a handkerchief, the kind worn to symbolically support knights. Without hesitation, Eve stood up and threw him her accessory with a light hand. The handkerchief fell precisely into the outstretched hand, as if it were a pre-planned part of the performance. The audience erupted in applause. Some shouted the prince's name. Others blessed his union with Madame Rodeline. Ellis could no longer hold back. She suddenly jumped up, her skirt flapping in the air, and in a moment she was running off the balcony. Tears welled up in her eyes. She stopped behind a pillar in the shadows, clutching it with both hands, and burst into a muffled sob. Shattered hopes and humiliated pride tore her apart from within. Eve soon found the Marquise. Seeing the familiar face, distorted by resentment and tears, she kept calm. Eve's, they say, was worried because she had disappeared so suddenly. But there was no answer, only a hostile look. Eve tried to find out what had happened, assuming that something bad might have happened to her friend. But instead, she heard accusations of betrayal. Ellis, gritting her teeth, frantically demanded an explanation. Her voice trembled with hatred and sounded like despair. The Duchess tried to remain calm. She remembered how people had greeted their couple, how Lex had called her his sweetheart. But with every word, the situation escalated. Ellis couldn't resist. She swung and only momentarily prevented her hand from hitting Eve. Eve managed to intercept the blow, calmly looking into her opponent's eyes. Her voice remained restrained, but there was an icy hardness in it. She made it clear that she had suffered enough, and that it was time to start over. Everything that had never really belonged to Ellis. But those words only fueled her anger. Ellis broke free and struck again. The blow was hard. Eve lost her balance and fell to the marble floor. Lex burst in at the scream from around the corner. He saw Eve lying on the ground, Ellis standing beside her, furious. His gaze was filled with dark fire. Before witnessing Ellis's massacre, Lex had been desperately trying to find Yvette. He had hurried along the same path that the servants had said she had taken after the tournament. Roy walked alongside, reassuring the prince that they were on the right path. Lex had shared his doubts with his brother the night before. He admitted that he had intended to give Ellis a handkerchief after the fight, but Hay had turned him down. Although the second prince remained with Ellis in his heart, his feelings became more complicated with each passing day. Hay, after listening to his brother, silently handed him the Golden Grail, a symbol that hinted at something deeper. He reminded them that Duke Rodellin himself would be present at the tournament, and it was unlikely that he would shake Lexian's hand after his deed. Lex's mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. He loved Ellis, but every time he looked at Yvette, he felt a strange unease. It seemed that her smile could erase any doubts. Taking the handkerchief she had thrown to him on the balcony from his pocket, he held it to his chest. Two feelings were fighting within him, and he could not understand whom he really wanted to protect. Lex couldn't help but think of Duke Winston. His face twisted in irritation. He didn't like the idea of the Duke paying attention to Eve either. He wasn't going to give in. At that moment, Lex came upon the same scene. Ellis had just hit Eve, and she had fallen to the floor, her hand pressed to her cheek. The prince had rushed forward, furious. He didn't listen to the marquise's excuses. Instead, he pushed her aside and fell to his knees before Yvette. Eve assured him that everything was fine, but her gaze was confused. Lex gently touched her hand, trying to calm her down. His tone became soft, and he tenderly called her his bride, promising protection. Ellis, who had been sitting on the sidelines until now, could not bear the sight. A new outburst of anger swept over her. When she shouted that she would not let Eve take Lex, the prince grabbed her wrist. She tried to fight, screaming about the betrayal, but suddenly felt a strong slap. The impact sent Ellis sprawling, stunned and humiliated. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. Her voice trailed off, and she stared at Lex as if she didn't recognize him. The prince calmly but firmly ordered her to calm down. Then he turned back to Yvette. He apologized for everything and admitted that he should have arrived earlier to prevent something like this from happening. Eve looked down awkwardly. She remembered Ellis's long-standing feelings for Lex and tried to find an explanation for her action, but the prince didn't let her doubt. He reminded her that it was he who asked her for the handkerchief, and he wouldn't let anyone blame her. Ellis, swallowing her humiliation, tried to say something again, but finally turned and ran. Her figure disappeared around the corner, leaving behind only a heavy residue. Roy, who had been watching from afar, still couldn't figure out what had happened. But Lex didn't hesitate. He said he would go talk to Ellis because he couldn't handle it. Eve instead asked for leniency. She didn't want to incite hostility. She felt that Ellis needed support more than punishment. Lex smiled with emotion and kissed Eve's hand, promising to see her in the evening. Then he turned to Roy, instructing him to escort the girl to her chambers. Lex followed Ellis, leaving Yvette alone with Roy. The atmosphere around them was filled with silence, as if the emotions they had just experienced had left a residue in the air. Eve took a deep breath and looked at her companion. Focusedly adjusting her sleeve, she asked if Roy had a handkerchief. Without further ado, he took a small piece from his pocket and handed it to her. She took it, but instead of wiping away the tears or dust, she quickly ran the cloth over her palm. The very one the prince had kissed just a few minutes ago. There was a sickening disgust in her movements. She hissed something about Lex's mouth only dripping with dirt, and the touch of his lips made her feel disgusted. She contemptuously threw aside the handkerchief she had ruined herself, promising to buy Roy a new one. He smiled faintly and simply nodded, saying, "Don't worry, princess." Her voice softened again as she asked if he was okay. She had heard of serious injuries. Roy answered calmly and confidently, assuring her that he would recover quickly. Eve looked away for a moment and sighed faintly. This scene was not supposed to be the end for her, but the beginning. So, straightening her shoulders, she nodded quietly to herself. Time for the final phase of the plan. Yvette carefully concealed the pain from the blow that had left a mark on her cheek. She tried not to show her vulnerability, but it did not go unnoticed by those around her. Sherry, one of the maids, was openly angry about what had happened. Eve tried to calm the girl down, assuring her that a little swelling was nothing to worry about. However, Sherry's anger flared up at what she saw. The scratches on the lady's snow-white skin caused her indignation. She couldn't understand how one could hold back so much when one was slapped in the face. If her ladyship had been less gentle, such actions would not have gone unpunished. She almost suggested, anxiously, telling the Duke about it, for she feared the situation would only get worse. But Eve knew that she couldn't let that happen. The Duchess warned Cherie that any disclosure could lead to trouble. The maid was embarrassed, not quite understanding what was going on, but her excitement only increased. She felt confused and afraid of the consequences. At that moment, the door opened and Duke Rodelzin entered the room. His gaze fell gently on his daughter. He lovingly declared that she was exceptionally beautiful today. Eve responded with a warm smile, happy to see her father by her side. They went out into the corridor and walked slowly. The Duke, noticing his daughter's hesitation, gently asked if she would like to share with him what was troubling her. The daughter shrugged, thinking that he would be sad if he found out the truth. He just smiled and joked that the daughter was no longer little, but already grown up and stubborn. Eve laughed softly, replying that he had noticed it only recently. The Duke took her firmly by the shoulders, looked into her eyes, and assured her of his faith in her. He recalled that he allowed her to organize this event because he believed in her abilities, even suspending the investigation for this reason. The man tenderly stroked her head, assuring her that he would never leave her in trouble and would always be there to support her when things got tough. Eve felt the warmth of her father's care, her heart filled with gratitude. She quietly uttered words of gratitude, realizing that she was not alone and could rely on this support. The evening was nearing its peak. Yvette walked among the guests, carefully observing their faces and sincerely wondering if they were enjoying the evening. The responses were sincere and warm. Cecilia enthusiastically noted that the event was a great success, and the other young ladies asked to be invited next time. Everyone wanted to extend the celebration. Eve felt her work was appreciated. Her dress, which she had worked on for months, attracted admiring glances. When Lex appeared next to her, he couldn't contain his admiration. For him, she shone like a night sky strewn with stars. Ellis looked at Eve with cold hostility. Their tension was palpable, but Eve tried to remain calm and even touched the Marquise's hand in a minimal gesture of reconciliation. Ellis responded aloofly, emphasizing that Eve was no longer the same as before, and contemptuously added that it was, they say, a noble appearance. The announcement of the speech of the Duchess of Rukina Yvette Rodelin gathered everyone in the center of the hall. Eve's came out with a slight smile, saying words of gratitude for the presence and concern. She did not hide the fact that she had been confined to a hospital bed for a long time. Her voice touched the hearts of the listeners, especially when she mentioned two close people, Ellis and Lex, who supported her in difficult times. When Eve asked them out, she expressed sincere gratitude, but there was suspicion in Ellis's eyes. She thought it was a play on the public. The waiters passed around glasses of champagne adorned with decorative peacocks, a symbol of fidelity and beauty. Lex smiled, but Ellis remained tense. The guests raised their glasses and clinked them, then drank them all the way down. After the speech, Uriel suggested that they enjoy a performance by the famous sword dancer, Elysia. The guests discussed with interest that she was renowned as the best wandering artist on the entire continent. Everyone was eagerly awaiting this show. An elegant dancer, in an exquisite costume with a transparent veil that hid her face, slowly approached the guests. In her hands, she held a sword that glittered in the light of the chandeliers. Everyone present could not look away. Every movement of her dance fascinated and kept them in suspense. The night before, after Duke Winston had left, Eve had suggested a private conversation. Hay sat with his arms around his knees, his eyes filled with sadness. He apologized, admitting that he had never imagined things would get this far. He was especially tormented by the thought that his brother could have caused Eve's to suffer, even fatally. Eve asked if anything would have changed if he had known the truth sooner. Hay remained silent, but admitted that Lexian had kept everything a secret and seemed to be just mocking him. He explained that Lexian was the next contender for the imperial throne and had a better chance than the other relatives. The girl admitted that at first she thought Hay was her older brother's accomplice, but now she realizes that she was wrong. She was glad that this was not the case. Hay admitted his cowardice, but insisted that he had always taken Eve seriously and asked for another chance. She replied that he shouldn't blame himself, but if he wanted to help, he had to do one important thing: advise Lexian to ask for her handkerchief as a reward. I'm sure he'll listen to his brother's advice. Only Hay can do that. Eve looked at him for a long time, thinking. Lexian was constantly torn between her and Ellis, and without her brother's help, the situation would have been much more difficult. So despite everything, she couldn't hate him. The hall erupted in applause, captivated by the dancer's performance. Every movement of her dance combined beauty and strength, which could not leave anyone indifferent. Lex also joined in the ovation. The dancer modestly thanked him for the opportunity to perform before His Highness, admitting that her skills were modest, but she was very happy to be a part of this important evening. She especially noted the main character of the holiday, Yvette, who was standing nearby. Eve felt happy that she had been able to give the guests an unforgettable evening, but she knew that this was the end of the event. The dancer respectfully addressed the Duchess, bowing to her. This caused a wave of inner satisfaction in Eve. Her long-awaited plan was finally starting to work. Suddenly, Lex jumped in surprise, and Ellis looked around in fear. The guests, confused by the situation, began to discuss what had happened. It turned out that the Marchioness Ellis Millick had been mistaken for the Duchess Yvette. This curiosity caused confusion among those present. Even the guests noted that they did not look at all alike. Ellis reacted sharply, demanding an end to this absurd farce and claiming that she was not Ms. Rodellin. The dancer, surprised, replied that she had thought so, for she had never seen the lady's face before, and therefore assumed that the Duchess was Ellis. Lex could not help but express his indignation at such recklessness, emphasizing the need for respect. When the dancer, confused, fell to her knees and began to apologize, Lex coldly ordered her to leave. The dancer explained that her mistake was due to ignorance. Lex warned Eve not to pay attention to these words, calling them carefree delusions. However, Eve showed her determination to get to the bottom of the matter, proposing to bring the dancer to justice. She swore in the name of the Duchess of Rodolina that she would do everything she could to find out the truth. The dancer said that 7 months ago she was invited to perform at Lex's private villa. There, she noticed a young woman with black hair who was always next to the prince. She had seen the two of them show tenderness and mutual affection, never taking their eyes off each other during her performance. This memory gave Eve confidence that everything would work out in her favor. Ellis couldn't help herself and abruptly threw the glass at the dancer. She barely managed to cover her face with her hands, escaping the blow. Mrs. Malik's indignation was boundless. She could not accept that someone had dared to tarnish the honor of the imperial family and the nobility. Her voice sounded hot and accusatory. Eve just watched, her head bowed, silently thinking about the pain she felt from the whole scene. She could see how bitterly and hopelessly it had hit Ellis. The young lady did not hide her resentment. She was the only daughter of the Malik family and could not tolerate such a disgrace. She demanded that Lex intervene, clear her name, and punish the offender immediately. The Duchess calmly but firmly urged Ellis to stop inciting the conflict. However, in response, Ms. Millick only grimaced, looked at Eves with an indifferent smile, and declared that she knew much more than she seemed. Her words confused everyone. The outraged guests began to whisper among themselves, not understanding what was happening and whether Mrs. Rodellin really had some secret. Eve decided to speak openly. She admitted that she had tried to hide the truth that was tearing her apart from the inside. But it became impossible. She was forced to reveal what she had kept inside for a long time. The words rang out like a verdict in the hall. Eve discovered that her fiancé, the second Prince Lexian, and her best friend Ellis Millick had been cheating on her for a long time, meeting in secret. Tears began to fall, darkening her face, and the hall was filled with a tension that had not been there before. The guests were stunned by what they heard. The secret affair that had surfaced cast a shadow over the prestige of the night's tournament. No one could believe in the formal engagement, which now seemed dubious. Some sympathized with Eve, because revealing such a truth was extremely painful. It was especially difficult for Duke Rodellin. He turned to Eve, perceiving her words as a frank confession. She admitted that she sometimes felt like an outsider around them, as Ellis and Lex had been close since childhood. They were both her friend and fiancé, although she hadn't thought of it that way before. Suddenly, Ellis burst into tears, apologizing for not knowing about Eve's feelings and for not understanding her feelings as a stranger. However, Eve only in her mind questioned the sincerity of this apology. Ellis dropped to the floor, pretending to be weak to elicit sympathy. Lex intervened, pointing out that his concern for Ellis as a younger sister might have made Eve feel like an outsider. However, he reproached her for overstepping the bounds of jealousy and that everything could have been resolved earlier. Eve couldn't help but accuse them of a nighttime encounter. She insisted that she had seen Lex kiss an angry Ellis and whisper to her that she was his only one. This surprised both Lex and Ellis. The prince explained that the meeting with Ellis was accidental, and there was no reason for jealousy, but his words did not calm the audience. At this point, Duke Winston spoke up, confirming the truth of Eve's words. He said that he had witnessed the meeting when he was returning late from business. Seeing Eve crying, and the two of them together, the second prince and the Marquis of Millick, Winston swore on his honor and the honor of his family that the betrayal was obvious. Lex lost his patience and accused Winston of wanting to curry favor with Eve. But the Duke replied that he would never have interfered if he had not learned this painful truth from Eve herself. Lex's face twisted in anger. He couldn't leave Eve in a difficult situation, so he showed up, even though it raised suspicions. However, he warned her not to reveal their relationship publicly again. Without hesitation, Eve approached the audience and told them the terrible truth. She had been poisoned 6 months ago. The hall erupted in a commotion. Everyone wanted to know who could have done such a thing. There was no answer until Roy, Lex's personal servant, approached Eve and told her about a rare poison from the Principality of Kaizan, a blue liquid that paralyzes and kills within an hour of consumption. He said that this particular poison had been secretly ordered by the second prince 7 months earlier, and then given to the Marquis Millick. 2 days later, Eve fell into a coma. The guests were stunned, their mouths open in surprise. Lex, furious, rushed at Roy, accusing him of lying. But Duke Rodellin intervened in time and stopped the conflict. Eve emphasized that this event was dedicated to her resurrection. She had defeated death and wanted to share her joy with everyone. Addressing Ellis, Eve said that she wanted her to realize what death is. As Eve approached Ellis, she spoke softly, but there was bitterness in her words. She remembered the moment she woke up and realized something terrible had happened. The girl knew that Ellis was behind it, even if her memory failed her. For her, it was a test of trust, one she accepted with pain but also strength. She asked why her friend had done that, since they were destined to be friends forever. Ellis, with tears in her eyes, denied everything. Eves confessed to the poison in the liqueur her friend had just drunk, infused with the rare plant kaleidoscope flower. This drink turned out to be a trap that frightened and stunned. Lex couldn't help but scream, but Duke Rodellin grabbed his shoulder. Ellis, panicked, rushed among the guests, grabbed a bottle of wine, and began drinking from it until it fell and broke. Everyone around froze in horror, and Eve stood aside, watching coldly. She explained that the Calais flower is a rare plant from the Mendeleev region of the Kaizhan Principality. Special processing turns it into Calais poison. If you steep it in alcohol, you get a wine with a wonderful aroma and deadly power. Ellis found herself on her knees, clutching her throat. Eve assured her that what she and Lex had drunk was just flower wine, not deadly poison. She wasn't a monster and didn't wish her death. But Ellis felt cheated and was angry. At this point, Eve, without holding back, announced her decision to break off her engagement to Lexian and resume the investigation to find out the origin of the poison and punish the perpetrators. Duke Rodelin, firmly and resolutely, promised to do everything in his power for the honor of his daughter. His words provoked cheers in the hall, and everyone supported his intention to achieve justice. The imperial palace fell silent as Duke Rodelin knelt before the emperor. Duke Winston stood beside him, silent and reserved. In a calm voice, Duke Rodelian asked for official approval of the annulment of the marriage contract. Lex stood beside his father, avoiding eye contact with the Duke. Emperor Liud responded with authority, agreeing to the request and asking if there were any other wishes. Duke Rodelin immediately requested permission to begin an investigation into the Marchioness Milik. Marquise Milik did not hold back and denied it, insisting that his daughter had been framed and the accusations were baseless. He warned against trusting rumors and suspecting Ms. Milik without evidence. Duke Rodelin felt his anger growing, especially when the Marquis suggested that it was Eves who might be seeking revenge for personal motives. Tensions escalated between the two men, and Duke Rodelin made no secret of his readiness for conflict, challenging his opponent to a fight. The emperor immediately intervened, ordering an end to the quarrel. He expressed his sympathy for the unpleasant situation and his surprise that his own son could be involved in it. The emperor's authority was unquestioned, and he decreed that the investigation should be carried out thoroughly. Duke Winston was instructed to assist Duke Rodelin in this matter. Lex was embarrassed to hear this, and Winston, in response, bowed and promised to carry out the order. Duke Rodelin and Winston left the audience chamber. After they left, Lex tried to justify himself to his father, but the emperor would not tolerate any objections. He slapped his son hard in the face, calling him a disgrace and expressing disappointment because he had high hopes for him. Lex, holding his cheek, was left broken and depressed, forced to remain in the palace under strict control. The morning in the Duchy of Rodelin began quietly. The door to Eve's room creaked softly as Cherie, the maid, peeked in, quickly signaling the others. Soon, several maids came in with flowers, carefully placing them on the table while the Duchess was still asleep. But within minutes, Eve slowly opened her eyes. The maids greeted her good morning, and Cherie didn't forget to point out the fresh flowers that had been sent as a gesture of support. She reminded him that the Duchess already had many invitations to social events, but Eve barely reacted, taking a bite of the sandwich and noting its excellent taste. Suddenly, Cherie couldn't hold it in anymore and burst into tears. She apologized to Eve, admitting that she had previously protected those who had betrayed her and now regretted it. The Duchess, noticing the tears, assured her that she was not sad, but rather relieved. Her anxieties seemed to have disappeared. Cherie was skeptical, because after seeing Eve lying in the room all day, she thought the Duchess was still in pain. But Eve explained that it was all part of the game. It wouldn't be appropriate to walk around the streets happily after an engagement break. It might seem strange. So she simply took the chance to relax. The maid apologized and promised to bring a change of clothes. Eve looked at the table and noticed the envelope. A sense of freedom echoed in her thoughts. The engagement trap with Lex was behind them. Ellis was now under arrest at Marquise Milik's estate, and Lexian was under house arrest at the palace. Thanks to Roy's testimony, evidence of the poison had been found. Everything seemed to be going well, but things had reached a dead end. Eve knew that Ellis was calm because she had an ally in Lexian. She was the only one trapped that day. The prince, having received the poison, apparently knew about the peculiarities of the Calais flowers and tried to calm Ellis, but her father wouldn't let him intervene. Eve never thought Ellis would remain silent in a situation like this. She wondered if Ellis really loved Lexian enough to take the blame. The thought made her laugh wryly. This must be the love story of the century. And in her last thought was a question. If Ellis was so serious, what would Lexian do? Silence fell over the Second Imperial Palace, as Hoy stood at the door for a long time, trying to contain his excitement before entering. Finally, he knocked, slowly opened the door, and walked in. What he saw shocked him. Lex was sitting on the bed, bent over and holding his head. his expression betraying helplessness and despair. His brother immediately asked what had happened to Ellis and if she had said anything. Hay remembered that she had been locked in her room for several days and had not given any explanation. The brother added that he tried to find Roy's witness, but he is under the protection of Duke Winston and is reluctant to make contact. Enraged, Lex abruptly overturned his chair, not hiding his despair. 4 days passed without change, and Marcus Milik still did not give up his position. The prince believed that his father would not abandon him, and that all was not lost. He looked for an opportunity to shift the blame onto someone else, desperately struggling with the situation. Suddenly, Lex grabbed his brother by the neck, accusing him of indecision and inaction. He reprimanded Hay for not watching over Eve and doing nothing to protect her. Hay tried to explain that there were a lot of people at that ill-fated party who also did nothing. Lex scornfully dismissed his words as pathetic excuses and ordered them to quickly figure out how to get him out of this trap. After releasing his brother, Lex asked why Hay had done it at all, since Eve truly loved him, even despite Lex's indifference. Smiling wickedly, Lex declared that the emperor would not tolerate a fat man at court and ridiculed his brother's opinion, accusing him of foolish joking intentions. Finally calmed down, he sat down on the sofa and said that the most important thing now was to make Ellis shut up. He hinted that there was only one way out of the situation and asked Hay for help. When his brother asked what exactly, Lex barely uttered a sound. To buy some calla lilies, Hay visited Duke Winston, seeking support in a matter that tormented his soul. The Duke, deep in thought, already understood that the main problem lay not on the surface. He greeted the guest with reserve, but immediately expressed doubts about the importance of this visit. Hay, not hiding his anxiety, explained that he had come to help Eves, and it was a matter of honor for him. The Duke smiled ironically, hinting that the help had been rather dubious. He joked about the tricks and deception that had accompanied the affair. Hay is sure that Winston is pursuing his own interests and wants to take Eve for himself. But the Duke replied with slight sarcasm that the lady herself turned to him for support, although he did not believe in her integrity. Suddenly, Eve appeared at the door, breaking the tense atmosphere with a light smile and a cheerful greeting. She immediately noticed that there was no agreement between the two men, as if a cat had run between them. The Duchess suggested that an operational meeting be held, immediately asking about the progress of the investigation. Duke Winston reported that the situation remained unchanged. They managed to find the merchant who supplied the poison to the second prince, as well as obtain the accompanying documents. However, this is only evidence of smuggling and does not reveal the full picture. Eve confessed that she had drunk the poison that Ellis had brought. She was sure that if the Marquise remained silent, the second prince would take advantage of this lapse in the investigation. She complained to Ellis, thinking about how to make her talk. Then Eve turned to Hay, asking about Prince Lexian's condition. Hay replied bitterly that his brother hoped Ellis would take their common sin to the grave. Everyone understood that the matter was far from over, and the fight was only just beginning. The prince remembered Lex's words, which sounded as if they had been plucked from a dream. To buy Callie, that was what he had ordered. But another picture was emerging in Hay's mind. Lex didn't plan to kill outright. He just wanted Lissy to admit her guilt and pay for her sins. And after that, the sick heir would die. His brother dreamed of the throne. He promised to ascend to it, having the support of Duke Rodellin. There was madness in this plan. He admitted that he had done a lot, but considered Eve stupid and naive. With Lissy gone, he would be clear to all, and Yvette would return to him without regret. The throne and the most beautiful woman in the empire would all be his. Lex laughed sinisterly, like a mad scientist, and Hay looked at his brother with deep sympathy. Eve, hearing this story, covered her mouth with her hand. She noticed that even though Lex's actions didn't change, Hay still tried to believe. He said that everything would be fine if he kept quiet. Duke Winston made no secret of the fact that he thought Lex was crazy, but Eve quickly stopped him from complicating the situation. Hay said he understood the situation and admitted he was afraid of losing Eve forever. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he didn't want to lose her again. After much thought, the prince decided to testify at the trial. He wanted his brother to answer for his actions. Eve tried to intervene, and Hay expressed his gratitude for the support, although at the same time, he did not want to harm Lex's position. But the Duchess pointed out that she had another plan. She explained that she had devised a method that would leave the prince no choice but to admit his guilt. This operation was to be the final step to bring the matter to a close. Eve and Hay walked slowly down the narrow street of the city. She could feel his inner brokenness, an invisible weight squeezing her heart. His eyes were sad, silent, and his steps were heavy. The Duchess stopped and gently took his face in her hands, moving closer. She looked into his eyes, trying to convey calm and support. The girl said that he was not to blame and should not tear himself apart. She had already forgiven him for everything. It was in the past. A tear fell silently from her eyes, but her smile remained warm. She thanked him for helping her in her most difficult moments and asked him to finally stop blaming himself. Hay, feeling this sincere impulse, couldn't hold back his emotions. A tear rolled down his cheek, and he hugged Eve even closer and tenderly kissed her on the top of her head. A secret thought never left her. Only one person could grant true forgiveness, the true owner of her body, Rukina. Eve hoped that she was watching from afar and would also want this peace. Ellis remembered how everyone admired her, whispered words of admiration. "She is so good. You are beautiful. The treasure of the Marquise Milik." It all seemed natural to her. Natural beauty, noble birth, and the boundless love of those around her. She had it all. She was considered the most polite, the most beloved child, as if fate itself had bestowed a blessing upon her. But one day, Yvette appeared. Duke Malek proudly introduced her. "Here is Yvette." That was when Ellis's life changed. Eve immediately attracted attention, took away everyone's gaze, and now everyone was looking only at her. The little Marquise felt betrayed and unnoticed. Out of nowhere, Duke Rodellin's adopted daughter appeared, an orphan with a mysterious past, attracting intense interest and gossip. This humiliated Ellis and filled her heart with bitterness. She pounded her fists on the bed, sobbing with anger and despair, telling herself she would never forgive. The girl hated Eve for taking everything from her: attention, love, status. One day, as they sat together over tea, Ellis watched Eve carefully as she ate cookies from Mr. Charles's bakery with delight. A spark of envy and a plan flashed through her mind. She told Eve that the more she ate, the more beautiful and sweet she became. Even adults began to notice her, for her sincerity and simplicity, for the taste with which she ate desserts. The girl smiled back, and the friend seemed to give away a part of her happiness, although she was struggling with jealousy. When Lex proposed to Eve, Ellis remained steadfast. She knew that Lex loved her, that her beauty and nobility were beyond doubt. But with each passing day, this confrontation only intensified. Ellis lay on the bed, broken and depressed. Her father silently entered the room and leaned his back against the door, not daring to break the silence. His eyes were filled with pain. She suddenly asked about Lex, whether he had transmitted anything. Her voice was restless, almost a shout. The Marquis grabbed his daughter sharply by the shoulders and sternly warned her that she was being used. According to him, the second prince seeks to shift his blame onto her. Ellis refused to believe this, convinced that the love between her and Lex was real and strong. She firmly believed that the prince would choose her, not Eve. Her father saw the situation differently. He sighed and complained about her naivety, calling her stupid because she couldn't see beyond her own nose. In desperation, he slammed the door and ordered the guards to keep their daughter out of sight. He thought what a shame it was. She had been raised to be the best bride. Meanwhile, the maid quietly brought the letter, trying not to attract the Marquise's attention. Ellis quickly grabbed the envelope. The letter mentioned a meeting with Lex at midnight. With mixed emotions, she soon changed her clothes. She threw on a simple dress, a cape, and a wig so that no one would recognize her on the street. Lex was already waiting in the office. She threw herself into his arms, and their kiss was filled with hope and comfort. Her lover tried to calm her down, wiping away her tears. He apologized for the late visit and asked if she was tired of waiting. She replied that she was willing to wait as long as necessary, but she noticed his depressed look. Lex assured her that his problems meant nothing compared to what she was going through. He suggested we have a drink and talk, to try to find at least a drop of light in this darkness. Lex carefully picked up the glass and opened the vial of poison. He moved with a cold confidence, as if he had long been accustomed to this game. Ellis, without hesitation, hugged him from behind, whispering about her fear of being forgotten and how she could have fallen into Eve's trap. Lex replied that she couldn't know. He had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He wanted to look at his mistress, even for a short while. This moment was never supposed to come, but now it was here. He held out his glass, and their eyes met in tense silence. Then they clinked glasses. Lex toasted their reunion, and Ellis drank the wine without hesitation. He watched her with a sly smile as his plan began to work. Everything was going as he had planned. There was an unfinished bottle of wine and 2 half-empty glasses in the room. Ellis sat quietly on the couch, leaning against Lex, her eyes filled with sad reflections. She could hardly believe what she was hearing, and the questions sounded as if from a shadow of doubt. Lex admitted his guilt and asked to forget the past, suggesting a start over. His love was the only salvation he could offer her. Ellis did not hesitate and agreed, although her body no longer obeyed her, her strength gradually leaving her. Lex sat with a satisfied smile as he watched her collapse on the couch, his pride mixed with cold calculation. Ellis's act seemed perfect to him, a woman sacrificing herself for him. He kissed her hand tenderly, as if paying homage to that sacrifice, but at the same time, he placed a bottle of poison and a note in her palm, documents that were supposed to explain the reason for her untimely passing. It was a cold and cruel game, where love became a tool to achieve one's own goals. The door burst open, and Duke Winston entered the room, along with Yvette and the group of heavily armored knights guarding the palace. Lex felt no surprise, only annoyance at their appearance. The knights grabbed his arms tightly, but he resisted fiercely, trying to free himself. Duke Winston announced that the second prince was accused of the murder of the Marchioness Milik and complicity in the attempt on Yvette's life, ordering him to be brought to the palace. Lex shouted after him, but the words were lost in the silence. Marquis Milik ran into the room, frightened and confused. He asked what had happened and stated that Lex had been coming and threatening him. Duke Winston asked the Marquise to leave the room, but the Marquise saw his daughter's body. The Marquise rushed to her, trying to bring her back to consciousness. The prince mentally admitted that such a thing could happen. Suddenly, the Marquis found the suicide note, and despair gripped his heart. He bitterly berated himself for leaving his daughter, certain that if she were alive, he would have found a way to make her happy. The maid apologized to the Marquise, explaining that she was worried about Ellis and had disobeyed orders by running away. But she was still late. The Marquis, hearing this, could barely contain his anger, while Lex continued to speak. He knew about Ellis's mistake made because of her love for him, and planned to expose Yvette's cruel heart to the people. But the proud Ellis refused to let herself be touched. That was her choice. If Yvette had not harbored a grudge, the tragedy would not have happened. The Marquise was furious, blaming Lex for his daughter's death, saying he would never forgive him. In his mind, he only prayed for his Lissy to be returned. Lex, irritated, shouted that he was innocent, but a woman's voice silenced him. It was Ellis. Her appearance came as a surprise to him, and he felt afraid. "Hey, Lissy?" Lex thought in confusion, unable to believe that the poison hadn't worked. It seemed impossible to him, since she was supposed to die. But Ellis stood before him, unwavering and determined. She would not forgive. The curse that fell from her lips echoed with coldness and implacability. Lex tried to deny it, trying to convince himself that it was nonsense and that she should have been dead by now. Yvette, who was standing nearby, revealed the real truth. The day Lex sent his letter, she sent hers, warning of the danger. It was Hiron who brought the poison, but he replaced it with water. That was the plan. Marquise Milik asked in surprise if it was all just a show. Yvette confirmed that her daughter had almost died today due to Lexian's conspiracy, and it was only thanks to her that the tragedy was averted. The Duchess turned to the prince with bitter irony, recalling how he had tried to repeat this attempt a second time. Lex fell to his knees, overcome with anger and disappointment. Eve asked if he was happy for even a moment, because the years had passed in vain. Suddenly, he snapped and swung at Yvette, cursing, but she reacted cleverly. She hit him with the hilt of her sword so hard that the prince's tooth fell out. Yvette did not lose confidence, mocking the fear that shone in his eyes. The Marquis and Duke Winston, standing nearby, watched this scene with a mixture of shock and admiration. The Duke noted with a smile that Yvette had honed her skills well, and she herself, raising her sword, declared that it was simply self-defense. Prince Lex could not hide his fear. The royal court was filled with tension. The Emperor gave Elis Melik one last chance to appeal the verdict. The girl replied that she only believed in love and loved ones, but she was betrayed. She called for justice and demanded punishment for the one who had taken advantage of her trust and tried to kill her, pointing the finger at the beaten Lexian. The prince wanted to justify himself, but the Emperor harshly ended the argument with a knock of the gavel. Eve, who was watching the trial from the hall, mentally noted, "Love is war." Then the Emperor turned to Yvette Rodelin. With pain in her voice, she spoke of the betrayal of her lover and friend, who, having a high status, undermined the honor of the empire. She demanded severe punishment so that such crimes would not happen again. Father Yves and those present in the hall listened, taking her words carefully. Emperor Louis, having heard the testimony of both, passed a death sentence. Lexian was stripped of his princely status and exiled to the northern border, while Elis was sentenced to life imprisonment in a monastery. Marquis Melik wept, and Lex jumped up in shock, unable to believe what he had heard. His pleas to commute the sentence went unanswered. The Emperor coldly turned away. The voices of those present began to spread the discussion. Some were happy about the victory of justice, while others found it difficult to watch this drama. Rumors spread that Duke Rodelzine had hired mercenaries to brutally beat Lex, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Finally, it was all over. Yvette took a deep breath, hiding the thought that she was behind the mercenaries who had brutally beaten Lex. No one would have guessed. Mr. Rodelin, although he supported the Emperor's decision, could not hide his disappointment. He confessed that even as a father, he considered the sentence too lenient. In his eyes, justice demanded greater severity. Yvette firmly replied that she did not wish for instant death, but for the guilty to live out their lives in pain and suffering. The Duke shook his head, agreeing with this bitter look. With words of relief that all the problems had finally gone with the convicts, Yvette felt joy and faith in the future. She urged not to dwell on the past, but to think about what lies ahead. Hugging his daughter, the Duke gently stroked her head, and at that moment, Yvette noticed that Hay had not arrived. Inwardly, she hoped that everything was fine with him. There was a 6-month period ahead to prepare for new challenges. Taking her father's hand, Yvette suggested having dinner together, confessing how much she missed the comfort of home and evenings together. It was all over, and now a new chapter of life could begin. Hay stood near the Duke of Rodelin's estate, gazing at the majestic walls that held secrets of the past and the future. His face was sad, his thoughts heavy. Marek, who had come up to him, reminded him that everyone was already waiting. Hay sighed, wiped his face with his palm, and thought of Yvette, wishing that every day of hers would be filled with light. Several days passed. Duke Winston lay in a hot bath, reflecting on recent events. As he stood up and pulled a black silk robe over his damp body, his attention was drawn to the envelopes on the table. When he asked if this was all the correspondence for the day, and if there were any letters from the Rodelin estate, he heard a negative answer. Disappointment gripped him as he lay down on the sofa, remembering Yvette's words. She is ready to repay him if he does not refuse her help. The Duke smiled, feeling that the time had come to ask for the return of the debt. At the Rodelian estate, Eve sat in an armchair, lost in thought. She felt confused. Letters from the courtiers and numerous invitations were piling up, but it all seemed empty and meaningless. The world around her seemed strange and alien, and longing reigned in her soul. She took out a pendant once given to her by the king of the underground kingdom, a green stone that allowed her to choose any talent. But Eve's thoughts were elsewhere. Should she choose this path, full of difficulties and dangers? She threw away the pendant, deciding that such a life was not for her. At that moment, a maid looked into the room, announcing the arrival of a guest. Eve was surprised to see Duke Winston in the hall. They exchanged greetings, and Winston reminded her of the promise she had made earlier. Eve confirmed her willingness and offered to discuss further plans. Winston took her hand and approached her, suggesting that they spend the day together. Eve was surprised, as she had expected a higher reward, but Winston admitted that he considered it sufficient. She agreed, and the Duke asked how she would like to spend this time. Eve didn't have an answer yet, but she admitted that she was preoccupied with other things. She opened up to Winston, telling him that she had 3 paths open to her, and she didn't know which one to choose. Everyone hides risks, and the choice seems difficult. The Duke replied with irony that riddles have become fashionable again, and suggested distracting oneself from worries. He asked what Eve thought of him, and her eyes lit up with delight, replying that everything was wonderful. Eve went out onto the training ground with Winston. He challenged her to hurt him once in 15 attempts, and she accepted without hesitation. A fight broke out, and Eve charged in. Winston, like a skilled swordsman, skillfully parried the blows. It wasn't hard for him to notice that she had become stronger, because the training didn't stop for a single day. Their swords crossed with a loud sound, and Eve thought that the enemy was not using magic, only the virtuosity of weapons. She used an unexpected trick. She crouched down and struck, but a powerful wave threw her aside. Winston asked anxiously how she had managed it. Eve smiled and pointed to the gash in his armor that marked her victory. She couldn't hide her joy, even as she acknowledged his incredible skill. Winston praised her passion for the sword, which surpassed even that of a knight. Eve began to feel a little embarrassed by such a compliment from him. Then the Duke turned to a subject that had long troubled him: the 3 paths that lay before her. He assured her that Eve knew her answer, for she was always honest in her feelings and not afraid of challenges. I remembered how for the first time she didn't flinch in front of Barclay, and how she bravely continued to train, despite his criticism. He assured her that he would support her no matter what path she took, because seeing her aspirations was a real pleasure for him. Eve smiled, placing a hand on the Duke's shoulder. Images of her past lives: gold medalist, medical resident, investigator, and heiress to a large fortune, flickered through her mind. They all passed quickly, but she lived life to the fullest and without regrets. This time, she firmly decided not to regret anything, but to simply enjoy life. The green stone in her hand symbolized her choice to become a knight. In the spacious drawing room of the Duchy of Rodellin, Eve sat next to her father over a cup of tea. He asked with slight concern if she had recently visited Duke Winston. The answer was yes. The Duke had indeed helped her recently. Outwardly, the father looked calm, but his eyes showed an inner struggle. He did not want to let his daughter go into the adult world. Eve talked about their sword fight, where she first felt the real difference between herself and the true masters. She later shared her doubts about the future, admitting that after recent events, her attitude towards nobility and the dream of a family had become more skeptical. The Duke reassured his daughter, assuring her that he would not force her to go against her will. Eve felt supported, but at the same time, she confessed an important intention that she was afraid to voice: her desire to become a knight. This caused an unexpected reaction from the father. He smiled at first, but then his face changed. The rules of the order provided for the admission of only young men of noble birth over the age of 19. Then Eve confessed that she planned to disguise herself as a boy so that she could join the knightly order. The Duke was shocked. He stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and forbade her from using any more knives. He ordered the sword to be handed over to Mr. Ethan, hoping thus to divert his daughter from a dangerous decision. The carriage rolled along the road, and Eve gazed sadly out the window. She had not expected such fierce resistance from her father. The idea of secretly running away from home to avoid unnecessary conflicts was already brewing in her mind. The sound of wheels reminded her of the long road she still had to travel. Soon they arrived at the village of Artsy, where life was going on at its own pace. The shopkeeper, Lloyd, was dusting the shelves, complaining about the incessant dust that settled almost daily. The door opened and Eve, cloaked in a cape, entered the room. She was greeted with the familiar slogan, "Lloyd's has everything except what it doesn't have." Eve turned to Logan, handing him the envelope with the answer. The man looked at her in surprise, not immediately recognizing her. She remembered their previous meeting, their promise that if she ever died, she would return here. Logan couldn't hold back tears of joy at seeing her alive. They sat down at the table to discuss the latest events. Rumors of the plots of the Second Prince and the Marquis had reached even the remote village. But it was Logan's information about the purchase of poison that was saving. He assumed that the girl had returned to take revenge on Milo. But no matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't do it, because innocent people would suffer. Eve already lives a different life and does not seek to return to the past. Logan noted with admiration that now she is a young duchess, and yet she has not lost her true face. Finally, Eve took out a bag of gold coins and tapped them on the table. She asked Logan to help her find out the names of the knights the order planned to accept within 3 months. Duke Rodelin stood by the window, gazing intently at the gray evening landscape, until a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Ethan entered the room, reserved and collected. He reported that the order had been carried out. The young lady had handed him her sword. The Duke sadly remembered that perhaps he should not have allowed his daughter to pick up a cold weapon. After all, now she aspires to join a knightly order, and was ready to go even to the wolf's den. He felt that this stubbornness would not leave her even after escaping. Ethan cautiously suggested using a certain remedy that could change Eve's mind. The Duke became interested and asked him to tell him more. Ethan moved closer and whispered something in her ear that instantly lit a fire in Rodelin's eyes. The Duke resolutely confirmed the plan and ordered it to be implemented. The Duchy of Rodelin Estate fell silent as Eve asked about the conditions she would have to fulfill. The Duke replied without hesitation. He wanted to verify her skill before granting permission. She must defeat Mr. Ethan before Dalian arrived, which was 10 days away. Eve was hesitant, since Ethan was one of the best swordsmen in the Empire, and she herself had only been training for 6 months. The Duke only calmly remarked that this was another reason to win, because disguising himself as a man and joining a knightly order was a violation of the laws. After joining, he will not be able to guarantee her safety, so she must overcome this obstacle with ease. Her father had hoped that she would surrender under such circumstances. However, if Eve won, he promised to respect her choice. She agreed, bowing to him. The door closed behind her, and the Duke exhaled with sadness and doubt, not believing that she could win. A week later, Eve stood by the river, washing her face with cold water. As she wiped it with a handkerchief and abruptly threw the cloth aside, anger took over her thoughts. Her frustration and anger were directed at the king of the underworld. She remembered his words about being able to learn anything, but the reality was different. Theoretical lessons, grueling training, and even life-threatening situations did not bring the desired results. Despite a week of using the green stone, no progress was visible. Eve realized that having skill was not the same as having true ability. Her physical strength, intelligence, and experience were far behind Ethan. Only the sword remained to her, and with it alone she would have to fight Mr. Ethan. Hopelessness crept into her heart, and she began to sob softly, but she quickly remembered Winston's words, who had not doubted her. With renewed determination, she gripped her sword and vowed to herself not to give up until she saw the result. Summoning her inner strength, she shouted, raising her voice so high that the birds around her flew away. At Leawood Castle, in the Crown Prince's chambers, Hay lay sick and exhausted. Merrick, his faithful servant, asked with concern if a doctor was needed, but the Lord strictly forbade anyone to be called. A simple cough could cause ridicule from the courtiers, and he himself looked pitiful, his face a pale shadow of its former self. Marek, tearful, felt guilty about the poisoned food the prince had eaten, and regretted not having noticed the ruse sooner. Hay apologized for his harshness, as the servant remained his last line of defense. Marique recalled that Lexian's exile to the northern borders had changed the order of succession, and now the crown prince was close to the throne. Hay agreed, recognizing that Duke Rodelina's daughter had done a great deed, and that this woman was a real danger. The prince realized that he might never see her again when he suddenly began coughing up blood. Marique urgently called a doctor. The attacks were becoming more frequent. Hay dreamed of seeing the world outside the palace, but time held him back. Eve stood opposite Mr. Ethan, ready for a duel. Duke Rodelin had set a condition. The winner would be the one who forced his opponent to drop his sword. Ethan warned that he would fight with full force, but Eve was no less determined. The Duke raised his hand, signaling the start of the duel. Eve skillfully dodged Ethan's attacks, combining agility with precision. Her sword gleamed in the sunlight, each blow precise and well-honed. Swords crossed in a fierce battle, and for a moment their gazes met. Duke Rodelin, who was watching the duel, could not hide his surprise. In half a year, the girl had reached a level that many considered unattainable. But he knew well that this was not enough to overcome Ethan's experience and physical strength. The Knight Commander, feeling superior, asked Eve to surrender, certain that her skills were not enough to win. But the girl remained adamant. She responded with determination, saying that the fight would continue until the last blow, and only after it was over would it be known who the true winner was. Ethan's sudden hard blow grazed her cheek, and pain shot through Eve's body. She felt her strength begin to drain, and she mentally begged for a chance, however small, to turn the tide of the battle. And that moment came. Suddenly, the girl was illuminated by a turquoise light emanating from the green stone she was holding. Ethan froze, confused, not understanding what was happening. Eve instantly took advantage of this pause. She gathered all her strength and delivered a powerful blow that cut the commander's sword in half. The Duke, who witnessed this scene, was stunned and could not hide his surprise at such an unexpected victory. Ethan, having lost his weapon, admitted defeat, and that the girl had proven her skill and determination. Joy overwhelmed Eve. She realized that she had achieved the goal she had set for herself. But from great effort and emotions, her strength suddenly ran out. She lost consciousness, falling into the arms of those standing nearby. Eve woke up in her room in the evening. Her father, alarmed by her condition, asked if she was too tired and if she wanted water. She only replied quietly that she was just resting a little after a tiring day. Duke Rodelin asked how long the girl had been able to use the mana sword. Eve replied that she had used it for the first time today. She had defeated Mr. Ethan and was now waiting for her father's permission. The Duke lowered his head, pondering what had happened. He explained that the mana sword was a weapon that required immense talent and many years of training to become a true master. For Eve's, it was an incredible achievement. In 6 months she mastered the art, but due to lack of experience, she lost consciousness. The Duke was worried about the possible consequences, because this time it happened at home. But what if it happened in more dangerous conditions? The girl looked sadly at her father and asked if this meant he would not give her permission. The Duke, smiling, urged her to train more conscientiously. Eve was surprised, but he explained that he could not refuse such a stubborn daughter. He was amazed by her talent and was glad to see with his own eyes the sign of a true fencer. It was incredible that this gift had manifested itself in his daughter. The girl hugged her father, thanking him for his support. The Duke emphasized that going against one's nature was dangerous and criminal, and warned of the risks that could await the family if they were exposed. Eve put her hand on her father's hand and promised to try her best for the family and especially for him. The Duke, with tears in his eyes, promised to pray for her and believed that she would overcome all the difficulties that fate would throw at her. A week later, the city of Arch welcomed Hay with cool air and quiet streets. The prince listened attentively as Merrick spoke about the local features. The assistant was emphasizing that the hotel had a hot spring, known for its ability to cure even the most stubborn cough. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by voices coming from nearby. Hay and Marek returned to find 2 women surrounded by several men. The women protested loudly, rebuking their attackers, while the men excused themselves by saying they were just having fun. The aide advised the prince not to interfere, saying it was none of his business. But Hay felt acute irritation and denied that the problems of his people were his own problems. Marique reassured that now was not the time to play noble, warning of possible trouble if he intervened. The woman, trying to free herself from the hands of the abuser, screamed, but the man sternly ordered her to be silent and follow him. Hay could not remain indifferent. He was overcome with powerlessness. Marique grabbed the prince by the hand and begged him not to interfere. Tears again appeared in the servant's eyes. Deep down, Hay felt bitter. The title of Crown Prince did not give him the strength to protect his people. It seemed like the same words were being said everywhere, changing nothing. When Hay looked around to understand where these thoughts were coming from, standing before him was a young man with brown hair, emerald eyes, and a slight irony on his face. The stranger made a joke with a smile about graduating from the Parasite Academy, as if emphasizing the actions of those nearby. The scum that had attacked the women noticed the strangers in the alley and moved towards them. The largest of them sarcastically remarked, that the thin young man was obviously looking for death himself,